Purging is at last at hand. The day of doom is here. All that is evil, all that are lies, your parents, your leaders, those who would call themselves your judges, those who have lied and corrupted the earth, they shall all be cleansed.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good day to all of our listeners. Ahnaf and I have Sir Wesley Stein with us. You may know him from his Substack as Twilight Patriot. Last year, Wesley made some predictions for what we were going to be seeing in 2025, and we've got him here on the hot seat. We're going to see how all those predictions turned out. Sir Wesley, thank you so much for joining us.
You're very welcome.
Good day, Sir Kenaz. Good day, Sir Wesley. Yeah, no, it's I think early morning for you gents, and over here it's kind of like afternoon. But no, like Sir Wesley wanted to do this show. I guess we can almost call it like a year-end prediction type of thing. These are actually good to have. I think Tree of Foe, aka Potter, he also does one of these things on Substack sometime in December. But no, Sir Wesley, let's kick it off, I guess. We've got quite a bit of ground to cover, as they say.
Yes, a lot has happened in this past year. I actually, beginning of January this year, I wrote my annual predictions post. I always do that for the beginning of the year at Twilight Patriot, and then I reviewed the predictions I made last year. I've never gotten them all right. Some years closer than others. I think this is one of my better years. Wasn't perfect though. When I predicted what would happen in the first year of the second Trump administration, I said things like, I think the Department of Government Efficiency is going to be a flop. I think it's not going to be competent enough. The people in charge aren't really going to understand the bureaucracy well enough to accomplish much of anything. And Elon
you
Musk
nailed that one, definitely.
They're going to get
you
bored
definitely
and
nailed
walk
that
away.
one. Yeah.
That totally came true. Vivek quit before Trump even came into power. He said, I'm not going to do it. And then Elon was in there for like 2 or 3 months, and then he quit too. And they had a falling out with Trump, and it didn't last as long as it was supposed to, or accomplish much of anything, except make a lot of people really annoyed by like cutting funding to health programs in foreign countries. And it was a tiny, tiny drop in the bucket of the budget anyhow. So I was totally right that would flame out, and then with the people especially getting bored and walking away, basically, not even a dramatic showdown or anything. I was right about that. One thing that I think I was too optimistic about, I said that that Chris Hegseth, Bobby Kennedy Jr., and the new Secretary of Education, Linda McMahon, I said that all three of them were going to make clowns out of themselves. And I said that at least two of them would either resign before the year's end or not get confirmed in the first place. They did make clowns out of themselves, but unfortunately, they're all still in office. I underestimated how willing the rest of the GOP was to put up with those people. So that was one of my mistakes.
The best way
I would
to understand
they would be clown themselves, though.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand. I definitely had like some, suspicions about how like long they would last, but it all makes sense when you understand that Trump is the kayfabe president. He basically, the people who like Donald Trump, his circle of admirers, really don't care if there's anything real happens. They're just waiting for the next exciting moment. Hey, Trump owned the libs. Bobby Kennedy really gets them steam, doesn't he? Linda McMahon wants to cancel the Department of Education. Woo-hoo! And it doesn't matter whether or not they really, actually accomplish anything. Just like it really doesn't matter to wrestling fans, oh, well, this whole fight between the Undertaker and the babyface is scripted. They know that, they just don't care. They're here to be entertained. This is, that's one of the things we've essentially degenerated to, where politics has become, entertainment, and people care more about the ratings and about the plot lines than they do about the country and whether or not anything is actually getting accomplished.
Yes, that is true for most voters. The ironic thing is that Donald Trump, even though I think he has the emotional maturity of a 10-year-old child, maybe it's down to like 8 or 7 by now. I said that a few years ago originally, and he is in cognitive decline. I'll admit that. But even though he has a very childish worldview, I still think he does not engage in sophisticated lying. He's the only president of my lifetime who has never told a sophisticated lie. He says whatever is on his mind, he says whatever makes him feel good, and he usually fails to follow through on his promises. He'll follow through on them if there are other people that are trying to make it easy for him to do it. That's why his judicial appointments turned out so good, is because he had the whole Federalist Society and Mitch McConnell in the Senate helping him to follow through on his promise to appoint conservative judges, which has been very good. He's actually the only Republican president since Herbert Hoover who did not appoint at least one pro-choice justice to the Supreme Court. Everyone else, from Eisenhower to Bush and everyone in between, they all appointed at least one liberal pro-abortion judge to the court. Trump gave us 3 solid conservatives. So I have respect for Trump for that. I also think the reason he followed through is because Mitch McConnell and the Federalist Society were there to make it easy to follow through. Also, it was easy for him to follow through on like moving the U.S. embassy in Israel to Jerusalem, which several presidents have made the promise to do that. They all reneged on it except for Trump, but that's also because it's a fairly easy thing to do by executive action, and there was really nobody or nothing legally stopping him from doing it with the stroke of a pen, and so it got done. So that's the difference with Trump. He doesn't tell sophisticated lies. He says whatever is on the top of his mind. He usually follows through with it if nobody is trying to stop him and if other people are making it easy. If it requires a bit of persuading or hard work, like building the wall on the border, nothing will happen with it. If other people are trying to make it easy for him to do it, though, he will do it. That's my opinion about Trump, and not telling a sophisticated lie, but he does have the maturity of an 8 or 10-year-old kid. So if following through on his promise is at all difficult, he'll get bored and walk away. And he also makes wildly exaggerated boasts about his own accomplishments and abilities, doing stuff like, I'm going to be the first living president in 100 years to put my image on the coins, which I just saw he was doing this morning, or everyone gets to enter national parks for free on my birthday, except for foreigners who don't get to come in at all. That kind of thing. And the portrait gallery of all the presidents on the White House veranda, where Joe Biden is represented by an auto pen since he wasn't really in charge. That's the stuff I just thought a little kid would do. But I mean, think about the actual kind of corruption and lying that we saw before from Joe Biden. Joe Biden did not do the childish stuff, but his whole career he was corrupt. He cheated his way through law school, plagiarized his thesis. His original presidential campaign, I think it was 1988, he quit in disgrace from the race after he had been plagiarizing his speeches from, I think, a politician in the British Labour Party. He didn't
It was very uncanny,
British
actually.
Politician would say, my parents were coal miners, and Joe Biden would say, my parents were coal miners, even though they weren't. And it was so embarrassing that he had to quit and let Michael Dukakis get the nomination instead. By 2020, nobody cared, and he got to walk all the way to the White House. So it's not like, that's why I say Trump's difference is that his lies are much less sophisticated, which is bad in some ways but good in others, because he actually will follow through on a campaign promise if there are lots of other people making it easy for him to do it, like with the judges. That's my opinion of Trump's honesty or lack thereof.
Yeah, I think that's fair. One thing I find very interesting about Donald Trump is he's in many ways, maybe in most ways, more effective than Barack Obama. There's less stalemates. He's more willing. Barack Obama was one of our smartest current presidents, maybe one of our smarter presidents since Woodrow Wilson. He's a very well-educated, very intelligent man. He couldn't get anything done. I don't think anybody would describe like Donald Trump as an intellectual. I'd be afraid like the man who would describe Donald Trump as an intellectual, I'd have to explain why he wasn't in words of 2 syllables or less. You know, I mean,
Yes,
it's like
he is.
he's not a smart man, but Trump has a great deal of charisma, you know, and again, coming back from his time work, like, you know, where his early fame in WrestleMania and then later The Apprentice, making people hate you is charisma just as much as making people like you. He
There is
manages
a
to,
nuance though. Yeah,
yeah,
but there's a nuance to it with regard to like, okay, well, he can talk very well, which none of us are disagreeing with that, right? But like Sir Wesley was saying, the cognitive decline is very easy to see. I
the
mean,
cognitive decline is real.
there was
Yeah,
like a photo yesterday. There was like a photo yesterday. It's a real photo. I thought it was AI generated, but it's actually a real photo of Trump using a walker right after signing the AI thing or whatever it was, right? And that's what this is, man. It's like, you know, he doesn't tell sophisticated lies. Yeah, sure, he's charismatic. Fair enough, right? But all these things are now conditional, right? He's like 80 years old. I mean,
I mean, I
when the
kind of have
Soviet
a
Union,
rule. Yeah, I have a rule of
yeah, yeah.
thumb for
Like when the
presidents. Go
Soviets
ahead.
were falling, exactly, exactly. Like what I'm saying is, just to finish the point, but like when the Soviet Union was falling apart, they had this string of like 80 something year olds and 70 something year olds, right? I
Yes,
mean,
but
we're not
Neanderthal
at
and
that
Bonanza.
point. Yeah, yeah, we're at that point where like we're seeing some bullshit like that as well, right? Is Trump gonna drop dead tomorrow? Probably not, right? But come on, guys. If the guy's using a walker, he's not, you know, the amount of days on a week that he's going to be charismatic is going to fall sharply. Let me put it to you that way, basically.
Yeah.
So,
No, I
yeah.
I mean I think there should be my rule of thumb for being president is you should not have a man in the Oval Office who you cannot wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, say, Mr. President, there's an emergency, hand him a cup of coffee or his like caffeinated beverage of choice, and 20 minutes later he's up and running. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
that
yeah.
should absolutely, you know, I mean, because those situations, what happens? It's 3 o'clock in the morning, you know, Mr. President, there's a missile headed toward the United States. You know, Mr. President Putin has just been shot. Something, you know,
Yeah,
something has happened that really changes the game. The president has to be available 24/7.
yeah.
Yes, he does. And
That's, you know,
I
I mean, I think that's a fair standard for
well,
Joe
by that
Biden
standard,
couldn't do
we
it by
haven't
four
had a
after
president
six
in many
o'clock.
years. In many years, we haven't had a president who met that.
Yeah, that standard has not been met for a while, right? Even even Obama, I think he was in his 60s or whatever. Actually, no, Obama's not that old. I think 1964,
I think he was
September
only 56 when he
50
left office.
something. Yeah.
So
Okay, so he was still
he's actually
capable,
on the
kind of.
younger side.
Yeah.
On the younger
Yeah, he
side.
was on the younger side. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I
He
mean,
could
the
he could
problem
do
with George W. Bush is you could wake him up and he still wouldn't be coherent, but that's neither here nor
it.
there. George Bush was a smart man. I mean, unfortunately, George Bush had the charisma of like Eddie Haskell. He was the guy, you know, always reminded me of the guy that rats you out to the teacher for cheating.
Are you talking about the older George Bush who
Older
was
George Bush.
in the
Younger
CIA?
George Bush, I wouldn't trust with a frat house beer run.
Right. The
Yeah.
younger
But
was definitely a post turtle, if you know the phrase.
yeah,
Post turtle. Yeah, Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney was basically, I mean, people called him the co-president during that time. He definitely was extremely influential during that entire term. Both of those terms, actually.
yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I think the
So
last president that we've had that I'd say was a highly competent, like working politician, negotiator, able to put useful things through Congress was Bill Clinton, in my opinion.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
agreed.
Barack
Agreed.
Obama was smart, but he lived his life in a kind of a sheltered way. He was a president of the Harvard Law Review, like first black president of the Harvard Law Review. I hear that saying
Yeah,
people say
yeah, yeah.
over and over again. That's his biggest accomplishment. And he was a law professor in Chicago for like 20 years or something. Community organizer, runs for Senate as a Democrat in a Chicago, which are like you gotta be smart to do all those things. But you don't really have to be confrontational or know how to get an agenda through a potentially hostile Congress like Bill Clinton did. It just brings a different kind of man to the front. So
Bill
I still
Yeah,
Clinton
say
was a
yeah.
Bill Clinton was our
schmoozer.
last really first-rate politician to hold the Oval Office. Obama was a
Yeah, yeah.
smart lawyer, but he did not have the like political skills of working with a potentially hostile Congress and hammering out useful compromises.
Yeah,
George
yeah.
W. Bush did not really have any political skills. Donald Trump, he has the advantage of he's honest in a very limited, peculiar way of defining that. and he'll generally do the right thing if nobody's trying to stop him, which is kind of rare, but he does have the maturity of a child, and he lies constantly when it's just a matter of self-aggrandizement and bragging about his own imaginary accomplishments and wildly exaggerated promises. And then, of course, Joe Biden spent his entire life plagiarizing his way through whatever he did. He was deep in cognitive decline before he even took the oath of office. And so yes, nothing really to admire there. You got to go back to Bill Clinton to have a real first-rate retail politician.
Yeah, I think that would be fair, because we've had kind of a string of mediocrities. I mean, the good news is Clinton was good at getting things done. The bad news is it was things like NAFTA.
Yes, it was things like NAFTA. It was things like saying, if we let China join the World Trade Organization, they will liberalize, which obviously didn't happen.
To be but to be fair to Bill Clinton, I mean, everyone thought that. Like, everyone was like, look, history has ended. China's about to become liberal, and we're going to have this like
history thesis. I think that thesis was racist, and let me explain that. The Cold War ends. The USSR falls.
Yeah.
About a third of the people that are living under communism at the time are suddenly in free countries. So the Soviet Union, the other Warsaw Pact countries, Poland,
exactly,
and so forth, also Mongolia. But the countries that stayed communist, which is China, Cuba, Vietnam, North Korea, and Laos, together they have like twice as many people as the ones where communism fell.
Exactly.
So if you wait for the ones where communism fell and said, oh, China, that doesn't really matter much, they'll follow suit in due time, you kind of have a white-centric view of history that doesn't really take Asians seriously as the actors in history, which is, I think, why they fell into that trap. They thought, well, they didn't consciously say it, but the subcontext was only the white people can be the actors in history. And since the two white-led regimes that these liberals hated most, which is the USSR and the old regime in South Africa, since both of those fell, they said, well, history has ended, and then the Asians will follow along in due time. Well, they didn't. Turns out the Asians have their own ideas about what direction history should go, and the inability to think of these people. And that's especially after 1989, when Deng Xiaoping orders the army to massacre the protesters at Tiananmen Square.
Yeah, that's right.
A lot of Westerners don't realize there were
like a lot of European groups, especially
high-level Chinese officials that wanted to compromise with the protesters, and they got overruled, and the protesters got shot. And to say, if we just let them join the WTO, they will liberalize. Well, at the same time, Deng Xiaoping is saying to the Communist Party over and over again, we must be very careful not to allow economic liberalization and economic ties to lead to political change. He's saying be very careful not to let this happen. When you keep insisting this will definitely happen, they can't stop this from happening, when they're perfectly aware of what you're trying to do and perfectly willing to shoot people to stop it from happening, you're just not taking them seriously as the actors in history. And it's kind of racist, because when white people are doing something you disapprove of, like the old regime, apartheid in South Africa, the Soviet Union, we kind of took that seriously and said, we need to isolate these people. We need to not sell grain to the USSR in order to keep them poor and unable to enforce their will on Afghanistan. We need to not let South Africa compete in the Olympics as long as they're racist against blacks. We need to isolate these people and make them feel ashamed to be a part of that country. But China, if we just let them join everything and tell them they're in the right and expel Taiwan from the Olympics to appease them, well then soon they'll admit that we're right after all, and they'll become liberal. So it's just
but
that views white
exactly
people as right. History and non-white people as the not actors in history.
Well, you're correct, right? But the thing is, it never changed, right? Like it simply changed form. It's like, okay, well, history has ended because against the white regimes became thing, and not just that. Like even 5-10 years ago, people were saying, well, China can't innovate, China can only copy, right? And this is not like, okay, one or two random people.
You say that if you know nothing about the history of the world before 1500, when China.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is like, this is not like one or two people saying it. Like it wasn't just like, okay, one or two random op-eds in the New York Times were saying, China can't innovate. It was literally like Times Magazine, The Economist, all these big guys. They're like, oh, China's innovation gap, or this, that, or the other thing, right? And they had openly like racist, racialist, whatever term you want to use, arguments. Like, okay, well, the yellow man kind of copies and the white man kind of innovates. Like, I mean, nobody ever woke up from this, right? And so I think it's kind of unfair to like Bill Clinton and these guys, it's like you always elect the leaders that you deserve, right? It's like, oh well,
Yeah.
Bill Clinton was too
Well, right
naive
now
about
we
China.
deserve
I mean,
Trump.
what I would
There
say
are
is that,
millions and millions of Americans with a
yeah,
similar personality to Trump, and he's like their
exactly.
avatar. That's why we have him
Yeah,
now. I
exactly,
mean,
exactly.
all of these
So
presidents
yeah,
represent something big in American society, else they wouldn't
yeah,
become
exactly,
president.
exactly. Yeah, yeah, exactly. So it's like, well, he was naive about China. I mean, people are still naive about China. Like if you tell them, for example, that in the Pentagon war games, all of the carriers go down in like the first 1 or 2 hours, in the first couple of minutes, they don't believe you. They think you're fucking lying, right? Then you gotta like forward them all the papers, right? And they still believe the same bullshit, right? They're not gonna change their views with new information, right? It's just that, like you're saying, right? They want an avatar and they kind of believe certain things. And I mean, even Fukuyama, like if you talk to Fukuyama today, right? Has he actually changed his view? Well, no, not really. He's kind of like, well, I got certain things wrong, but that's because, this, that, or the other thing was wrong, right? And I'm not gonna entirely change my thesis. What I'll say is, I got it wrong this way, but I'm kind of still right about the end of history thesis, right? I'm just going to change the goalpost a bit. I'm going to say that, liberalism and democracy and these things, this is going to be the best ever society for man. And the thing that we're going to come after that, it's going to be like this anti-globalization, less resources for everyone, etc., etc. By the way, this is not what he was saying, right? Like if you actually read his book, right, that was not the exact thing he was saying. He was saying that after liberal democracy and these types of other variations, right, you're not going to have any meaningful like difference with regard to like, okay, well, there's going to be this other ideology like communism or something else or whatnot, which would like rally the world around it, right? Which that also ended up being false, right? Because again, we're seeing the nationalist stuff all over the world right now with regard
Right. I mean,
to,
I think
That's an
yeah,
important point. You have to
yeah,
remember when Clinton was in office, people
yeah.
really believed, because I remember when the Soviet Union fell, we
Everyone
really
believed it.
thought this was
Everyone
the
believed
end of
it. Yeah,
history. Hey, okay, we're going to have a free world. I mean, we never had a free world before, but we're going to have a free world, and in the mind of Americans, the free world meant everything was going to look just kind of like America, maybe with
yeah.
slightly different decorations, food, and language, but it was going
Presidential
to be
presidential
America.
republic. Yeah, yeah, presidential republic, parliamentary republic, maybe a few variations of that, but that's really what the world looks like. Yeah, everyone
right,
believed
and
that,
that's
right? And yeah, well, like
right,
if you said, well, a politician was naive. Well, no, he wasn't naive. He was literally just listening to what all the people were saying.
he was still naive. He was just naive in a big company of naive people. That
Exactly.
is
Yeah,
I
that
mean,
yeah.
is what he
That's the
was.
right
to
way of
his
saying it.
credit,
Yeah, that's
Ross Perot called that out, what was going to happen.
yeah,
The giant
yeah.
sucking sound you hear is like, American manufacturing jobs look away. Oh, look at that idiot. He thinks we're going to lose our manufacturing sector because we're opening up the global markets. Look what an
Well, yeah.
idiot he must be.
I mean, it wasn't
Yeah.
just the markets, in my opinion. I actually think the main problem is just the growth of the regulatory burden and the amount of lawsuits that you have to deal with if you build anything physical in America has just made
Yeah,
it an
yeah, yeah.
unattractive place to do business too. I think that's why places like Japan and Germany, until very recently, held on to their manufacturing better, even though they're globalized, just because the regulation it's just done better. It's not like Japan doesn't have environmental regulations. It's just that the regulations are much clearer in advance. You kind of know what the limits are on how much of such and such chemical you can emit or whatnot. Whereas in America, it's more like you propose to build a mine or something, and then there's a long period in which anyone who wants to can file lawsuits against you to make you file environmental impact statements, and you're basically guilty until proven innocence. You have to prove your own innocence, and the laws are vague, and lawsuits can be reopened at any time. So it might take, on average, perhaps 10 or 20 years of suits. And we've only had 3 mines open in the United States in I think the last 22 years. Whereas places like
Hmm.
Canada and Australia, that we Americans are used to saying, well, they have big government there, but actually, as far as mining goes, they don't. Which is why lots of people like study mine engineering in school in the U.S. and then go to Canada or Australia to work because
Yeah.
the regulations there are much clearer. And it's not that they don't care about the environment; they very much have rules about to stop you from putting toxic stuff into the environment. It's just that the rules are a lot clearer. Everyone knows in advance what they are, and you're more likely
Yep.
to be enforced by the government and not by random private activists who are allowed to sue people in a completely different state than they're in because the laws are wide open. And so that's also harmed American manufacturing. That's actually something I've criticized Trump and his old administration for, is that they think that foreigners are the main problem. Well, here's the thing. America, biggest economy in the world, biggest manufacturing and technological power in the world for many decades in the mid-20th century. Very different than the situation was under Henry Clay in the early 19th century, when we needed tariffs in order to protect our infant industries from European competition. We take the money from the tariffs and put them into internal improvements, mostly canals at that point, because the railroads were like very new, but later into railroads. And that was the idea of, we have an infant economy, and if we just let people do a pure free market thing and buy whatever foreign goods they want without a tariff, then they'll just buy foreign goods if it's cheaper, and there won't be any reason to build up American industries, which will take a long time to become competitive. If we protect them with tariffs, then after a few decades of investing in American industries, they will be competitive. And that actually works. That's how America industrialized. That's also how pretty much every other country industrialized for the first time, except with this one exception. United Kingdom. United Kingdom was the only country that industrialized without a protective tariff, because there weren't any other industrial countries. That nobody else was using coal to run machinery at all. So no one to compete with, no tariff. Literally every other country that industrialized, United States in the 19th century, France, Germany, late 20th century, Korea, Taiwan, China, Japan. They all had industrial policy. They all had tariffs. So as a way to industrialize a country, you definitely need it. The difference with America, though, is we were an industrialized country. We were at the top of the pack for innovation, high-tech manufacturing, all of that. And then we declined to the point of, like, we were the leading shipbuilder during and shortly after World War II. And now we don't make any ships except military ships. And all our civilian ships are bought mostly from, I think, Korea, and with some from China and Japan.
The yearly amount is somebody ran the math. I think it's like 0.75 military ships per year on a good year, right?
Yes, and if you look at it's very humiliating. But the main reason for it, though,
the civilian shipping, and the civilian shipping is basically 3 countries. It's China, Japan, South Korea. That's it, right?
Yeah,
that's basically it.
The main reason for this decline is too much regulation, too many lawsuits, and the decisions that you have to navigate through are just made too slowly with too little presumption of innocence, and just makes it uncertain and a bad investment to build most things in America. And my opinion is, you can't fix that just by tariffs. It's true that tariffs were what helped us industrialize in the early 1900s, but our problems now are different. A mature, dominant society should not need protective tariffs in the same way that a 19th century America did. And the fact that it seems necessary is actually the sign of a sickness that has other causes, an internal sickness that if you don't address it at the root, the tariffs are a half measure. And as we're seeing right now, they're actually hurting American industry quite a bit, because they're making it more expensive for America's remaining manufacturers to get a hold of a lot of the precursors and parts that they're used to, like buying from Canada and Mexico, especially nowadays when the economy is way more interconnected than it was 200 years ago. And you're building something like a car in Detroit or whatever, and your various different parts are crossing the border between Canada, US, and Mexico maybe 5 or 6 times as they go into various stages of the assembly process before the car is finally, last pieces are put together. And putting tariffs on that does not make American manufacturers richer.
Yeah. I mean, like, if you're on the upslope to industrialize, you need to protect your infant industries, right? I mean, and that's kind of like what the data shows as well, right? But the thing is, if you already have industry, right, you're in one category, but then let's say you're on the downslope, right, and you're kind of losing, right? At that point, like, what happens is tariffs actually make you lose your supply, right? Because again, where are you getting your supply from, right? You're getting your supply from all these other countries, whether it's energy flows, material flows, et cetera, right? And what the tariffs do is, again, the tariffs are a tax, right? Customs and these border patrol people, they're the ones who collect it, right? The lion's share of the time, it is paid for by the consumer, because that's how it kind of gets passed on. Businesses can soak it up for a little bit of time, which is kind of what we saw sometime in like September, October, but then they inevitably they pass it on to the consumer, right? And so what ends up happening is like if you're like on the downslope and you've got these businesses and companies soaking it up and then they pass it on to the consumer, what ends up happening is they have to do decisions like, okay, well, we got to make the factory smaller, we got to fire people, or we got to, buy these substitutes that are more expensive, or we got to do a combination of that, et cetera, right? And at that point, you just get an inferior product, right? You get an inferior product, and you basically get a situation where, okay, if we don't get an inferior product, what else is the option? Well, the option is you don't buy the thing at all, right? And that's kind of like, if it ever gets to the point where, I don't think it's gonna happen though. I think he's gonna chicken out, pussy out of the tariff bullshit, pretty much like he did in his first term, except there's gonna be more damage this time around, right? But as he does so, right, there's gonna be certain companies that just go broke and go busted and never come back, right? I mean, we're already seeing like the Chinese basically they crossed their fingers and they said, "Oh, don't worry, man, we'll buy American soybeans again," right? After they put in the export controls or whatever, right? But I mean, the volume is only like less than 10% of what it used to be, right? And so that's what this is now. That's what this is of like, well, your importers got hurt, right? Just from the tariffs themselves. And then that was before other countries retaliated. And then other countries retaliated. Uh, and now even your exporters are putting like not putting rather, but they're getting these controls shoved on them, right? And they're getting hurt as well, right? And that's where we're at. This is probably the early steps of an international thing. It's not just America. The tariffs were more like a pin to the bubble, right? The bubble was there since at least COVID, right? China's been in deflation since COVID. But like that's the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is the world's largest manufacturer is in deflation, right? It is flooding the market of Europe and these other places with this cheap product. Meanwhile, all these guys, right? It's not just America, right? It's Germany, it's Japan, it's the UK, etc., etc. Their bonds are beginning to break out. That's very bad. The last time this happened, a couple of these guys they did use historical charts and stuff, but the last time this happened was in the 1920s, right? Bonds broke up decisively and they stayed up for about 60 years, right? If we're headed for another 60 years, right? Most of these countries are not going to make it. They would literally just go insolvent, right? And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the dysfunction, right? We're seeing like a country like France. They literally can't run a government anymore. They're just like, okay, well, every 1 month or 3 months, there's a new government that shows up. Then the prime minister resigns because he can't pass the fucking budget, right? And then it just keeps happening again and again. And it's like I'm
gonna
yell loudly
in this decline than the United States is.
Oh yeah,
a few years ago, I hadn't really realized that because it seemed that European politics was just kind of less over the top, less insane, and also their manufacturing.
Oh, their situation is way worse. Oh, exactly.
Germany,
like their situation is way
I
worse.
think 2015, they did a better job of holding on to their manufacturing jobs, their manufacturing economy. They also had better infrastructure. Like you can get a lot more places by train in Europe than in the US. So I had admired that. And then 2015 comes along and the floor falls out. Like Angela Merkel lets 1 million Middle Eastern migrants into Germany. Everywhere in Europe is letting huge amounts of migrants in. The next year, Britain does Brexit, which is supposed to fix the problem, but it doesn't because Britain's problems are just too deep to fix with that kind of solution. And so you have all the migrant crime, the censorship of anyone who criticizes it, the economic suicide when Germany just decides to shut down all its nuclear power plants without really having anything to replace them with because a bunch of environmentalists convince them that they're bad. And
well, that's the thing, though. I think it's more tragic than that.
We can wage a civilizational war to contain Russia while also totally depending on natural gas from Russia. It's just such a fantasy land.
But that's the tragedy, though. But that the thing is, right? I agree with about 80% of what you're saying. But the tragedy is that let's look at the country where the quote unquote like green activists or whatever didn't win. Right. Okay. Well, France. Okay. Well, France is a country where like 70-80% of its nuclear powers, it generates the electricity and the energy flows. I mean, France is more fucked than Germany. Right. because like it's 2025 right now. The French themselves, if you talk to them, they'll tell you this, right? If you administer some truth serum, but they'll basically tell you in the next 15 to 20 years, roughly out of the 50 something nuclear power plants we have, we got to shut down at least 40, right?
Because they're getting too old. Right.
Yeah,
I'm
they're
aware
getting
that
too old.
the
They're getting
reason
too old, and
the thing
and
with
it's
the
not
old
just
nuclear
they're
power
getting too.
plants is when you have a nuclear reaction running, it's emitting lots and lots of neutrons, and some of those
Yeah,
they strike the elements in the walls of the container and they transmute
yeah, that's
them,
right. That's
and
right.
that damages the crystal structure because suddenly you
Yeah,
have
that's right.
elements with the wrong chemical properties. So they're all designed for like a limited lifetime. They're actually designed to with refractory materials that are specifically designed to withstand this for a certain number of years, but not forever.
That's
And so
correct.
usually
That's correct.
they built these, they gave them an operating license for 40 years. There's a factor
That's
of
right.
safety built into that, of course, but nobody
Yep.
expects to operate them longer than that because they think, oh, technological progress, we'll have much better reactors in 40 years.
Yeah,
We
that's
won't
right.
need them.
Oh, I
40 years
just saw
comes
an
around,
announcement
they
on
don't have the
Twitter.
better
Yeah.
reactors, so they start extending the operating licenses because it's too expensive to build new ones. So like we're going to run this for 60 years. We think the
You're
factor of safety is
absolutely,
good
yeah,
enough.
exactly.
And
Exactly.
eventually it's
You're
going to go
correct.
50 years. And I think some
Yeah.
people are going to extend these to 100 years. And eventually there's going to be another Chernobyl-like event because of this.
Yeah.
I don't think they're
that might
going
lead to
to.
all the nuclear
Yeah.
powers getting shut down immediately. And that just means you're going to have blackouts. You're not going to have lights in your house except maybe 2 or 3 hours a day, like it is in
The
Africa, which I've
French.
been to
Yeah,
once.
yeah,
And yeah,
yeah,
you
yeah.
have power for like 2 or 3 hours a day. That's
Well,
the
the
future you're
thing with
heading
the
towards.
French, I mean, the future is already here. That's the thing. Like the French in 30 years' time, right? It's 2025 right now. In 30 years' time, the 40 plants, right? Okay, the 40 plants are going to be replaced by, and again, you can ask the French, how many replacements do you have right now? And they'll tell you, okay, 40 are getting shut down, 6 replacements might go up, right? And we're saying might because, like, they're trying to build these things, but one of them's been under construction for like 19 years and they can't finish it, right? Because again, it's not just the environmental activists or whatever the fuck, right? Like, that's not the main, like, that's a secondary reason. The main thing that's happening is the population is aging, right? When you have an aging of the
Right.
population,
It's
right?
harder to find good young workers as well.
Not just that, not just that. There's another effect. That's correct, right? It's harder, but it's also the fact that as you get older, the older people on top of the population pyramid, they look down and they say, "Oh, look, man, we need the taxes, we need the pensions. All right, I got money. I can buy the politicians and the lobbyists. All right, man. Now we're gonna enact policies which literally make life hell for young people, right? And
Yes,
this
that's true.
accelerates the process. Okay. And so what happens is, okay, you're a guy who studied nuclear engineering in one of these like French universities. Well, grandpa has now increased the fucking taxes on you, right? And so you're like, what the fuck is the point of staying in this country? I literally can't live and I can't have a family and what have you. And so you leave. And so it's like there's a brain drain that happens. Number one, it's not at that level yet where it's like crazy high, right? But in the 2030s, 2040s, 2050s, it's going to be very high, right? And so that's the second thing. Like you're saying, number two, older people, less skills, et cetera, et cetera. And number three, right? Labor intensive work, right? Labor intensive work. Well, I mean, if you're a 75-year-old grandpa, you're not going to be doing the labor intensive work. And so together, what you get is you get like a giant vampire economy, right? But like the green activist stuff, that's more like a secondary, tertiary effect of like disgruntled young people who don't know what the fuck they're doing, getting random ideologies of like, man, if we just fix this, man, everything will come back, right? Like that's rubbish, okay? Like the French are completely fucked, Sir Wesley, right? Like if you look at their like electricity production numbers, it's like 80% of it is from fucking nuclear, right? 80% of it, right? Okay, well, 80% of it is from fucking nuclear. And out of that 80%, 80% is probably going to get shut down, right? So you're looking at 50-60% reduction in like power generation within the next 3-4 decades. That's not survivable, man. I mean, you can't, okay, you've got 69 million people right now. We can start doing the mortality math with regard to how many people literally just die and how many people emigrate when you get like a 50-60% reduction of like, electricity generation, which by the way, you don't need to have it happen overnight, like you're saying, right? You can have like a 1 or 2% decline per year or whatever, right? For several years, right? But like that society, it's not like French society was infected by the woke virus or whatever the fuck, and therefore French society collapsed. No, French society collapsed, or rather is collapsing, because a bunch of old people decided that we're just gonna vampirically feast on the young. That's what's happening here, right? Like,
that's part of it.
That's literally, yeah. I mean, it's, you know, and that's a decision that they chose, right? It's not
Right.
like
And when
people.
you don't have enough young French workers to support
Yeah,
everybody, you
yeah,
bring in
yeah,
young foreign workers from places like Libya, Algeria, Morocco.
yeah. Iraq, Syria, all the shit, right? And you're not doing it because you care about the migrants. You're, oh my gosh, we love fucking migrants. No, you're doing it because you're the grandpa. You're like, someone's gonna pay for my pension. Someone's gonna pay the taxes. All right. Oh, the young people are leaving. Well, sucks to be them. Fuck them. Let me get some migrants, right? And that's what this is, right? Like it's not like, well, like the right wing retards that you interact with, right? Like they say, "Oh my gosh, it's a Jewish conspiracy or whatever the fuck," and it's like, "Oh yeah, our brain has been corrupted. We're not proud to be European anymore. Therefore, all the migrants are coming." Dude, that's not what's happening. What's happening is the old people need someone to pay the fucking pensions, right? And if they can get Ahmed from fucking Syria to do it, they'll do it, right? They don't care, man. Like, okay, they'll get a bunch of Vietnamese people. Well, okay, there's not that many young Vietnamese people. Okay, where are the next young people at? Well, the next young people are in Iraq. Oh, they don't exist anymore because it's 2065. All right, let's go to Nigeria next, right? And that's what this is, right? And they're gonna keep doing it, man. They're gonna keep doing it because, again, well, like Sir Kenaz, he said it over and over again, right? Like, society has not learned yet how to live in a non-growth paradigm, right? The paradigm is still growth. All right, someone is running the pyramid scheme, right? Uh, and then everyone at the bottom is gonna pay for the pyramid scheme, right? That's kind of like the industrial paradigm, and that's been true for about 300 plus years, and nobody has gotten out of it yet,
Infinite
practically speaking,
growth
right?
in a finite world.
That's literally what this is. That's literally what this is, right? All the other stuff is secondary, tertiary. Of like, okay, well, this guy has some crazy ideology about like green, whatever the fuck, and then this other guy hates Europeans or whatever the fuck. It's all secondary and tertiary. It's like byproduct by effects that come from the wider predicament, problem, whatever you want to call it, right? And I don't think the Europeans, right? Like, okay, some random populist government gets elected tomorrow. Are they gonna suddenly stop this? No, they're not, right? They'll do the same bullshit. Like, what's the name of the German chancellor? He's like Friedrich Merz. He's like, oh, we're gonna stop migration from Afghanistan and all these dangerous countries, right? And then like 3 weeks later, he starts like flying in the migrants, right? They're not gonna stop this, right?
Right.
They're not gonna stop this because to stop it would mean that somehow the pyramid scheme ends, and the pyramid scheme cannot end. Because if it does end, it means, again, the old people don't have people paying their pensions and getting exploited, etc., right? And they know what that means. They know that if that stops, it means excess mortality for them. To
Okay,
put it politely.
we're
Yeah.
in a situation where I believe with South Korea right now, if the current birth trends continue, granted that's a big if, 100 Koreans will have 6 great grandchildren.
Yes, I've seen that news too. Their country does not have a future. It's all cram school and test prep, and that's
Yeah.
like what young people do 15, 16 hours a day, and they're not breeding. And I actually wrote about that briefly on my blog, and probably the only article I've ever done that discussed spectator sports in detail. I
Yeah.
called
Yeah.
it the 12-team college football playoff is absurd. And I talked about how it was mostly talking about how I don't like it, the 12-team college football playoff format, since it basically turns college football into a sort of NFL light where everyone's talking about who's going to get what seed, and not a matter
Mhm.
of, okay, you played your season. If you had a perfect season, you go to the championship game. If you had more than one loss, you definitely don't, and you mostly care about local rivalry. So I talked about that for a
Yeah.
while, but I also
Mhm.
talked about how even just in our education system, we're too focused on, like, we have a handful of elite athletes that we care about their athletic performance, but we pretty much stopped caring about physical education for the majority of students, majority
Yep.
of kids. We have a few elite college football teams that we care about, but
Yep.
we no longer care as much about, oh, you got a football scholarship to go to a school that is mostly notable for its academics because, hey, we think that if you were good at football as a high school student, that shows a sort of toughness and strength of character that might actually make you a better doctor or lawyer someday. And so you're going to go to this mid-level state school and you're going to become a doctor or a lawyer and you're going to be proud of it. Not because you crammed your way to it, but just because we realized, oh, you have the right skills for this job. But basically, we encourage people to kind of have more diverse interests. We didn't have such a rigid hierarchy with Harvard and Yale at the top of everything. Right
Mm-hmm.
now, I think Harvard and Yale between them, 8 out of 9 Supreme Court justices are from those two schools. And before Trump came into office, it was 9 out of 9. In I think the
Yep.
1950s, they were from like 6 or 7 different schools. And I think one of them hadn't even gone to law school. He studied it under an apprenticeship in the old way. So it's just, you have a few schools that are totally monopolizing the status hierarchy. And then you have kids doing endless test prep to get into those schools and kind of becoming antisocial eggheads. I mean, South Korea has the problem 100 times worse than we do, but even the light form of it that we have here, where it's like, okay, we care about the athleticism of a few of the really good athletic schools, and we care about the academics of the people who do test prep 15 or 16 hours a day, and we have this easy way of ranking schools from best to worst. And only if you get into the 2 best schools, which weirdly Harvard and Yale give out nearly all A's because the standards are really low once you've taken all the tests to get in, and then it's very easy to get A's. It's a sad system because it doesn't actually encourage like multiple status hierarchies and encouraging people with like diverse talents to get into high status positions and encouraging local elites. And like 100 years ago, if you were from like South Carolina, where I am right now, it was a lot harder to get into Harvard than today because Harvard, it was full of like legacy admissions and people who are just barely good enough to go into college, but their relatives went to Harvard, so they're going to Harvard. And so it was harder to
Yep.
get into Harvard, but at the same time, the status gap between Harvard and Clemson wasn't nearly as big as it is now. And so it was just
Yep. Yep.
easier
Yep.
to get into a state school and then get into a prestigious job doing law or medicine or whatever you were going to do. And so
Yep. 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 Yep.
it just didn't have that immense pressure to be in the 99th percentile and not just the 95th percentile of the test, or otherwise your career is over when you're just 17. And obviously putting young kids under this pressure leads to like a total collapse of fertility rates, a total collapse of just friendship and any socialization in general. And China has the problem, Taiwan has the problem, but South Korea has the problem worst.
Here's a
Yep.
prediction I will make for 2026, and we'll see if it goes. I expect we're going to see quite a few private colleges closing, maybe even some public colleges shutting down in 2026, simply because I feel like the student loan game is over. We can charge ridiculous amounts on tuition because we can give people loans to pay it. And, the loans come in free and we don't have to care. We know they'll be paid back.
Yes,
That is
that is the
coming to an
problem.
end.
It's basically the road to hell is paved with good intentions because you have this welfare state that says, well, everybody has a right to health care, or everybody has a right to go to college. And then they basically make laws ensuring that no matter how much that thing costs, it'll be paid for, perhaps by the person who's actually using it, but perhaps by the taxpayer, perhaps by a government-backed guaranteed loan with no risk for the lender or whatever. And then because the people that are actually selling it, the Medicare affiliated healthcare providers or the colleges or whatever, because they realize, oh, the government's making sure this will be paid for. We can charge way more than we used to charge, and it will still be paid for. And that's why healthcare and education are so ridiculously expensive in the country. So you have these well-intentioned welfare programs that really just end up making people spend a bigger portion, much bigger portion of their money on healthcare and education, whether that's their own education through student loans that they actually pay off because they got a productive job, which not all of them do, or whether it's other people's education through their taxes, their own healthcare, other people's healthcare through their taxes. We spend about twice as much of our like per capita GDP on healthcare as Europe does, and we don't live any longer. So we're not getting a better product. It's just our mixed public-private system where the government makes sure everybody can pay for the service, and then private providers profit off of the service. That's actually one of the things that I kind of break from most Republicans on is realizing a mixed private public system is often the worst of both worlds. And
Hmm.
sometimes just a straightforward public option would be better. I actually think that healthcare would be cheaper in this country and much more affordable if we just replaced Medicare and Medicaid with a network of publicly funded state hospitals that poor people can go to and say, well, if you're rich, you can pay to go to a more expensive, nicer hospital. If you're poor, you go to this government hospital where the treatment is either free or you pay just a very small token fee to make sure that people don't use it frivolously, and that's it. And but what the government shouldn't be doing is saying, we're going to have this program where private people provide health care and then the government pays for it at whatever ridiculously inflated private price the oligopoly demands. That is the worst of both worlds.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, I think that's like absolutely because what what it becomes is a wealth pump where where public money goes into private pockets. I mean, I think the reaction to COVID is the perfect example of this. That was an enormous wealth pump where we have an emergency. We have to take care of this, of this, and we have to give billions of dollars to large pharma companies who are then and we're going to say they're not going to have to worry about being sued if they just throw out something that's dangerous, and we'll even shut down people who complain about potential dangers. What that is, that's exactly what happened. It's like we were, that I can't. I won't go so far as some people do and say that COVID was entirely created out of thin air. So Moderna and a couple other companies
Oh,
could
I
make
believe it's a
billions
real
of
disease. I've
dollars.
had it a few times. I've had it a few times, and I mean, being in my 20s, I've recovered pretty easily, but it's, I think, still the worst sickness I've had in the last decade, I think. So
It's
I'm not
not
gonna
pleasant.
speak lightly.
It's very unpleasant. Yeah.
I mean, it was a particularly nasty case of the flu. We've had other
Yeah.
flu seasons that were that bad, with flus that were that bad. The problem was the rumor got around about bio leak from a bioweapons clinic. And I think people panicked.
Yeah.
I think it probably. I think it was leaked from a lab. I do not think it was leaked from a weapons lab. I think it was gain of function research. Just people
Yeah.
in America that decided to fund this because if you're a scientist, your career will live or die by how many publications you have. And so you are
Yeah.
motivated to exaggerate the usefulness of whatever science you are doing and to
Yeah.
play
Yeah.
down the potential harms of it. And so you had a lot of people who had a self-interest to say it's really important that we collect every bat virus on every bat
Yeah.
in the cave in southern China where they were collecting the bats and like catching hundreds of bats in nets and swabbing them for viruses. We need to do gain of function studies to figure out which of all of these hundreds and hundreds of viruses is closest to infecting humans and what genes need to change for it to infect human beings. And when you do that research, and when you do it in a country like China, where the lab safety protocols are like pretty bad, like apparently after this happened, they were interviewing people and found out that well, we have these biohazard labs, like level 2 or 3 or whatever it was, and the door is supposed to be closed to the lab whenever people are going or aren't going in and out, but actually the lab was full of equipment, and so they just put a freezer in the hallway outside the lab and propped the door open so that they could run the cord into the lab. And this is like this super biohazard lab, such that in America, when we build this kind of lab, we actually keep it at a lower air pressure inside the lab than outside. So whenever anybody opens the door, you get a draft of air inward. And so no like virus particles or anything are blowing outward. That's like how careful you're about this stuff in America. But in China, it was extremely lax. And then in China, if somebody like accidentally sticks themselves with a needle in this lab, you're supposed to go into quarantine or get bitten by a mouse. You're supposed to go into quarantine. And in America, we do that. In China, it's like, oh no, if I do that, then my social credit score would go down. I could get fired. It will make the entire lab look bad. And so basically, because it's this authoritarian system where like punishments and demerits are handed out much more liberally, everybody has a motivation to flatter their superiors, to hide problems from their superiors. If like the boss of your lab is a member of the party and you're not, then you're not going to criticize your boss for propping the door open to put the freezer in the hall, because like big punishments could happen to you if you speak ill of someone higher in the party. Whereas in America, like America has its problems, but we do not have that particular problem. We have much more freedom of speech. If your boss is breaking a safety rule, there are ways you can complain and not worry about personal retribution. And because of that, we have much safer labs. But the decision of these Americans to fund the research in China because it's easier to do and it'd be illegal to do here, but not there. I mean, it's definitely a joint Sino-American snafu is what this is. It is a joint Sino-American snafu. We are not innocent, but at the same time, we definitely should not have been funding this research. And that's also another of the reasons that I think that Donald Trump is like a poor champion for our cause, is because the entire time that the COVID restrictions were rolling out and the masking rules, social distancing, closing most schools and businesses and all that, Trump was totally useless. Trump was totally, he never tried to do anything to hold the people who lied about gain of function research to account. That was all like the only politicians that championed that were kind of fringe figures like Rand Paul. Rand Paul was against COVID tyranny all the way through. Rand Paul was in favor of investigating and maybe even impeaching people for lying about gain of function research all the way through. Like, I think that the House actually had a case if they wanted to. They could have impeached Anthony Fauci as director of the National Institute for Health for lying to Congress about gain of function research. You don't have to prove that it came from a lab. You just have to prove that he lied about it. It's like the Bill Clinton case. It's like, we're not going to get him for adultery because that's kind of antiquated. We're going to get him for lying under oath. Well, Fauci did the same thing. Whether it came from a lab or not, he definitely lied about whether the US government was funding that stuff. And in my opinion, Congress should care about that, but actually only a few fringe people like Rand Paul did. And not even Trump did. But because Trump is this great actor, this pro wrestling guy, he's able to convince everyone that he's their champion in the fight, even when he's very performative. While the guy that actually stood up for them, Rand Paul, they mostly kind of ignore and think, oh, this Rand Paul person, he thinks that Social Security is insolvent. He's going to take away my Social Security. I can't give him my support. And of course, Rand Paul says that because he's just too honest to lie about it. And like, I think everyone knows this deep down, this is insolvent, but you don't get ahead by campaigning on that. And so you stay in the fringes, even though you're one of the few people who realizes there's a problem.
I think that's one of the structural problems that is going to be really bad for America, for Western style democracies in general. If you come out and say, look, things are bad, there's no real cure for our economy, we are going to experience an economic downturn, we are going to have to do more with less, we're going to have to get used to things being more expensive and a declining standard of living. There's no way you'll ever.
Yeah, you're gonna get a multi-decade. Yeah, you're gonna get a multi-decade stag deflationary crash that has multiple waves, and this time around, you don't have the young people to start off 2 world wars to kind of take the gas off the deflation. If that's your sales pitch, man, I mean, Sir Kenaz, you're already going to lose from the get-go.
Yeah,
because people want their optimism.
Somebody who will blow sunshine up the electorate's ass. That's just
that's literally it. Yeah,
there is no way. That's one of the advantages you have. It's like, yes, there are disadvantages to a one-person military dictatorship like the Soviet Union or like Maoist China, and they have their own sets of problems. But it's much easier for a strong man to take control and say, look, it's time for blood, sweat, tears, and toil, and it's things are going to be bad, but we have to do this.
Ironically, that quote comes from a guy in a parliamentary democracy. So
well,
it's
yes,
not like
I
there
knew
wasn't a
that
time
as
when we
soon
could
as
do
I
that
opened
too.
my mouth. But I mean, maybe if we get to the point, where we've got a war on our doorstep, things will happen. But if we right now we don't, we're not even in the place Britain was as a declining empire with Germany as a rising, like state local power. We're a declining empire. I don't know if we could win a war with Venezuela. I wouldn't bet a large sum of money on it. A
Guys,
war
Sir
with
Kenaz, don't worry
Iran,
about it.
a
Sir
war with
Kenaz, Sir
Iran,
Kenaz,
yeah.
Sir Kenaz, don't worry about it. He just has to blow up a hospital and say mission accomplished. That's called
Yeah.
victory, man.
I mean, what I expect is, it is possible we will get an Afghan style victory. We create a beachhead on Venezuela. We put a couple military bases there, maybe take a tiny swatch of territory. Everybody else in Venezuela essentially is ignoring us, and you have has its own thing going on. And it's like, then after a while, when it becomes too expensive, we pull out and we declare, our mission, our goals have been reached.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's pretty much what we've done with every war since. We didn't, we weren't officially defeated in Vietnam. We left when it became clear that we couldn't accomplish our objectives. So what we did, our objectives have been accomplished. Time to go. I mean, nobody was fooled by it, but will it give them enough of a fig leaf that they can claim, we won in Venezuela, even though a Maduro or a Maduro supporter is still in charge, and nothing has really changed for anybody. I don't know if the public will buy it, but I'm pretty sure they'll try to sell it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm even more pessimistic. I mean, I've looked at Rand Corporation and then U.S. Army War College. I've looked at all their stuff. To take Fallujah, 10,000 American troops, 3,500 British troops, and an additional, I think, 1,500 to 2 grand. They say Iraqis, but I think it's just a bunch of Kurds. So 15 grand, basically. 15 grand. They were up against, if my number is correct, 15 grand. They were up against 6 grand actual terrorists, and then another 10 grand of lightly armed militiamen, right? So, all right. They took like 1 month, 3 weeks or something for that thing. Again, Fallujah is like a tiny town of 250,000, and they lost how many? Like 110, 120 total killed in action. Wounded in action was like 600 something, right? Like brutal casualties, like 700 casualties to take like a tiny ass town in like 2004 when America had overwhelming ISR rather overmatch, right? I mean, we're 20 years in the future. I mean, Venezuela is going to have some stuff. It's a state entity. It's not going to just be a lightly armed militia. Uh, I don't see, even if you made the same argument, you're like, okay, well, Maduro is in this tiny town on the coast for like the next 48 hours, drinking the margaritas and stuff. Now's the time to like grab him by the pussy and just like, arrest him or whatever. So we're gonna send in the Marines and just kidnap him, right? Even if you believed in that and you just like try to simulate it, right? You're gonna get 100 dead Marines, right? And I don't think there's any appetite in America for 100 dead Marines, right? Like,
Right.
and that's the reason I think, why he hasn't done anything. It's like he wants a perfect outcome of like no Marines are dead, right? We just get in there, grab Maduro, take him back to wherever the fuck, torture him a bit, and then we just tell everyone we stopped the narco terrorism or whatever, right? And because they don't have that, and they're like, okay, yeah, we're gonna take one casualty for every 25 that we inflict on the enemy, right? That's why he hasn't done anything yet. It's just like, okay, well, what do we do? What do we do? Well, find a better plan, guys. And then
Right now, what they do is they bomb
yeah,
fishing boats 100 miles from the coast.
bomb a fishing boat,
that
yeah,
oil tanker the other day and say,
yeah,
we're fighting drug trafficking.
yeah,
And
fighting drug
a
trafficking by
lot of
stealing oil.
right, and
Hilarious,
most
yeah,
of Trump's base will cheer him on. Some people see
yeah,
through it. Like Rand Paul will get up in the Senate and criticize him, but most of
yeah,
them just cheer it on or just ignore it if they're too intelligent to cheer it on. But yeah,
yeah,
it
yeah,
is
yeah,
really sad because I'm seriously worried about like the future of the rule of law in this country because we talk about the rule of law all the time, but
yeah,
historically, that's actually meant for like most of the last few decades is the the judiciary is in charge. The other branches of government, their power is whatever the judiciary says. And within that framework, you can get away with a lot. So, so for instance, like what Trump did, I mean, you bomb a fishing boat hundreds of miles from American shores, but because it's a foreign policy thing, nobody can really be sued over it, over basically precedents that have existed for a long time, saying that the court should stay out of foreign policy. And on the other hand, that's kind of reasonable, because if the judiciary was ordering the president to do stuff in foreign policy, then we would have bad foreign policy, because the decision making would be very slow and it wouldn't involve compromise. It would be one side lays down the law and you do foreign policy in that way. You kind of get into a lot of unnecessary wars. So you have to have a president who can make decisions quickly and negotiate and do compromises. But because there's like no judicial oversight, that really only leaves one entity that can prevent the president from making a mockery of the Constitution and how he conducts wars, whether it's invading a country that you're not at war with, or bombing a boat and killing everyone on board when you should have just like boarded them and like arrested them for piracy or whatever and tried them. I'm not saying you like to be tried for piracy, but like since the Constitution was written, the government had the power to like arrest people, try them for piracies and other felonies committed on the high seas. There's a clear constitutional precedent for just arresting those people and trying them. But that would also be
that's what the law says.
And so the president just says, this is a military thing. I'm ordering an airstrike. And then there's no real
that's actually
anyone.
Well, here's the hilarious thing. Exactly. Here's the hilarious thing, Sir Wesley, right? Military law, the America's naval law with regard to law of the sea and military law itself, what it says is, if it's a civilian object, you cannot strike it. If you have 100% evidence that it is a military object because there's drugs on board or whatever the fuck, right? I mean, again, huge burden of proof that has not been met, I can say confidently. But let's say you meet it, right? In that case, you're supposed to strike the engine, disable the boat, and you have to arrest everyone on board and then try them, right? Now, here's the hilarious thing, right? Let's say you fuck up. Let's say you didn't hit the engine, you hit the boat on the side or whatever. It's on fire, right? As soon as that happens, then law of the sea kicks in with regard to, okay, what does the law say with regard to the shipwrecked? Well, what it says is it doesn't fucking matter what they are. It doesn't matter if they're terrorists. It doesn't matter if they're enemy combatants or civilians or whatever. If they're shipwrecked, right, they have the same status that the German parachutists did when they were knocked out of their fighters and they were parachuting down. Right, which is that they're off limits, right? And you know, Sir Cleveland Blakemore, who we've had on the show numerous times, he's like a ex-soldier, right? So he knows this stuff like the back of his hand. But he just flat out said, yeah, I mean, this is literally, you know, America criticizes Nazi Germany for being a bunch of evil monsters, and Japan, they just kill prisoners. I mean, America's doing the same right now. They're killing the shipwreck.
Right, and you can say, well, this is against military law, but who's going to enforce it? I mean, the Supreme Court is not going to enforce it because they ruled last year that the president is absolutely immune for like any civil or criminal cases over his conduct. That leaves Congress. Congress could impeach Chris Hegseth for ordering the double strike on the boat. They're not going to, though, because impeachment is a political process. You have all these grandstanding and speeches, and then you vote on whether the president is a member of your party or not. That's what you vote on.
Basically, that's basically what it is.
So the presidents know the judiciary is not going to hold me accountable because he said that I'm absolutely immune, and the Congress is not going to hold me accountable because it's fully partisan, and nobody will vote against their own party over something like this, especially when Barack Obama did very similar stuff in the Middle East and got away with it. It wasn't as scary because it was a lot further from home, but he did.
Well, I would say, I mean, international law is interesting. You're absolutely correct, right? Like, you know, it's a political thing. Impeachment, this shit's not going to happen, right? But people make the error of like, okay, well, why does international law exist? International law doesn't exist for America to show everyone, oh my gosh, look at how moral we are, right? We are moral and you're not. That's not the fucking reason, right? The reason international law exists is to make sure that everyone overseas, whether it's military or civilian personnel, they have leeway, right? So, okay, well, if they ever get captured or if they ever get hit or what have you, how can we get them out? Well, we can tell our adversaries or the terrorists or whatever that, look, you know, we don't see eye to eye. We don't like each other. But here's how we treat prisoners when, we deal with them, or here's how we treat the shipwrecked when we deal with them. Can we get a little bit of that from you guys as well? That's literally, and so like when America's doing this and they're literally doing like, I think Heck said right now, there's articles of impeachment against him. I think it was officially filed, right? But I think the argument they're making is, okay, he didn't just order a double tap. He also said just kill them all, right? And I think one of the boats was hit like 4 times or whatever, right? Like what that really does, Sir Wesley, is okay. Well, is Hexet gonna get impeached? Is he not? That's
When the
actually not
Democrats
relevant.
win the House back, I think they are going to impeach him
Yeah,
and
they're going
Trump
to. They're
over
going
this.
to.
And because
Exactly. Right.
Republicans have too many Senate seats, I think they're going to get acquitted. I think that's what's going to
Yeah,
happen.
yeah. What I'm saying is that's actually the secondary concern, right? It may or may not happen. I don't know, right? But the primary concern now is there's American bases, there's American civilian personnel, right? There's just random American tourists everywhere, all across the world, and now they are now fair game, right? It's like, oh, you are from the Yankee Satan. What does the Yankee Satan do? The Yankee Satan kills people who are shipwrecked. I mean, you're
Right.
just a fucking pariah, man. Why
I
do
mean,
I treat you?
we talk about
Yeah,
how one of our
yeah,
goals in foreign policy is to contain China. And look at what
yeah,
China's doing. They claim that all the fish in the whole South China Sea are theirs,
yeah.
even when it's very close to like the coast of the
Yeah,
Philippines or
9 dash
Vietnam or
line.
wherever.
Yeah,
And they
it's a
send
9 dash
their
line map.
militia
Yeah.
boats out, their fishing boats that are like also part of their sea militia,
Yeah.
quasi-military, whatever it is. They go out.
It's
They
a militia. It's a
then they
sea
shoot the
militia. Yeah, it's a sea
Vietnamese people
militia.
with
Yeah.
water cannons to drive them out of the fishing grounds and keep all the fish for themselves. And look, this poor Vietnamese fisherman, his arm got broken when he was shot with the water cannon. This is
Yeah.
proof that all the countries here need to unite to contain China. Now, on the one hand, it is true that pretty much all the countries in that area have an interest in containing Chinese
Exactly.
expansion.
Yeah,
On the other
that's
hand,
correct.
the idea that America is somehow the moral leader after what we did with the Caribbean boat, that's just insane. Like,
Yeah.
if those countries are going to successfully contain China, they're going to do it the moment they admit that America is not a safe country to rely on as an ally. America is a frail reed to lean on. We're far away. Containing China isn't core to our interests. And after what Trump did with that Venezuelan boat, we don't really have any moral superiority over China anyhow. And so if those countries decide,
But they
if
were
those
carrying
countries at
drugs,
some
Sir
point build
Wesley.
them, if
but
the
Sir
Asian
Wesley,
countries,
what I was saying, Sir Wesley, is that the boats carry enough drugs to kill 25,000 Americans. Therefore, it's perfectly okay to hit the boat 5 times and kill everyone on board. That's literally the argument they're making, which is like a fucking 12-year-old argument.
It is. But the only people they have to justify it to is the Republicans in the Senate, because that's the only entity that can hold them accountable is Congress through impeachment. So if the Republicans in the Senate say yes, they don't get impeached, keep doing it. That is, we talk about the rule of law, but actually with absolute immunity for the president, absolute immunity for judges, absolute immunity for prosecutors, to the point that a prosecutor can basically, we picked up DNA evidence at the crime scene. It doesn't implicate the person we want to prosecute. Let's just burn it. You can do that legally as a prosecutor, and you can't be sued, even if the evidence comes out that that's what you did, because of absolute immunity of the prosecutor. And so after you declared so many classes of power for people to say, well, these people have to follow the Constitution if they have a conscience, but nobody's going to make them follow the Constitution. Well, the problem with relying on people's conscience is that not everybody has one, and Americans are learning that in the hard way.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the stupidest things George W. Bush did, and I will be the first to say that's a really big thing to say, was when he came out and said, we're no longer worried about we will use enhanced interrogation if we feel like it.
Yeah.
Okay, you realize now, like, we always knew. It's something I'm really big on. Is like, okay, we always knew that if somebody had genuinely, was about to drop a nuclear bomb in a major city or something, and this guy knows where it's from, we knew we'd do whatever it took to get the information out of it.
So you bring out the thumbscrew.
Yeah,
bring out the thumbscrew.
We made
but that's
it.
Not.
Yeah,
it's not what we're actually
looking
at in in pretty much
Yeah.
all the cases where we've actually used it. So.
Yeah, but it's even more than that. It's like we knew, okay, you can use enhanced interrogation, in extremis. Understand it could be the end of your career.
Yes.
Understand you could go to prison if you authorize this. Make it so like, okay, we're not doing this unless it's genuinely necessary. Saying we no longer care about the Geneva Convention. Well, then why should anybody who's fighting you care about it either?
Yeah. That's basically my point. My point
Yeah.
is not whether Trump is gonna get impeached by the Senate or whatever the fuck, right? Like my point is the bigger picture of what this means. The bigger picture is that if you can double tap, triple tap, and just kill people on the seas, even if they're shipwrecked, I don't give a fuck if they're criminals or this is literally the most fucking illegal thing you can do, right? You shouldn't complain, man. You shouldn't complain if there's a civilian tanker in the Persian Gulf, right? It gets boarded and people just get like massacred on it, right? Right? And this is the problem. The problem is once you go this route of like, well, we are just above the law, man. We can just do whatever the fuck we want. It's just a bunch of black and brown Untermensch out there. What are they ever gonna do, right? You're just setting yourself up like that, right? And like, oh well, law, justice, this stuff, man. We are in this time of war. Pete Heck said, "Fucking talk like a tough guy." He is literally putting American lives in jeopardy with this bullshit that he's doing, right? As Secretary of Defense, and I personally think he should resign. I don't think he's going to, right? But if he actually had some conscience of like, okay, well, I'm actually putting Americans in jeopardy and in danger all around the world with my actions, he would actually, do the thoughtful thing and resign. But yeah, I don't expect that to happen, and I expect things to get way more interesting than it is currently, right? Especially with regard to how world events are moving, right? I mean, I don't know if you gents saw it the other day, but like one of these Japanese fuck, what was it? It was one of these like Japanese squadrons, right? They locked onto one of these like Chinese vessels, and the Chinese locked back in response, right? Which was like a very, very big escalation, right? Because if you lock onto the jet, what that really means is you're a few seconds away from firing at it, right? Which is like a big escalation, right? So, and the Russians and the Chinese and the North Koreans, they flew, not flew rather, but it was the Russians and the Chinese who flew near the South Korean identification zone, etc., etc. Lot of funky things are happening. We're seeing more and more frequency of flights closer and closer to like the air identification zone in Alaska, right? The frequency is increasing and whatnot. So everything is in place with regard to all these other powers. They're saying that, look, do we expect America to attack us tomorrow? Not really, right? It's more likely that it's going to implode, right? But we are prepared to defend ourselves if it comes down to it, right? Because again, like, what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed, right? One of the big things that Bush Senior worried about was, okay, oh my gosh, the Soviet Union is going to collapse. What happens to the nuclear arsenal, right? Which idiot is going to have access to it, right? And not only that, what are these nationalist governments going to do with the nuclear arsenal after the Soviet Union is gone? They actually didn't want the Soviet Union to collapse, right? Their idea was, well, it just ruins global balance, right? And if global balance is ruined, right? Because again, like, what happens when cheap technology, not cheap technology, but like what happens when powerful technology suddenly becomes cheap and it's available to everyone? Well, that's just the end of the Westphalian world system, right? Because what does it take for a state to govern its territory? Well, you need monopoly of state violence, right? Well, that's not really possible if dirty nukes are available to every fucking terrorist in like Africa, right? And that's like the absolute worst case scenario that you want to avoid, right? And that's why whether it's China, whether it's Russia, whether it's America, they've always been very, very cognizant of the fact that, look, none of us actually follow international law or whatever the fuck, right? But we at least have to pretend that it exists, and we at least have to do the bare minimum, because if we don't, right, 10 moves down the chessboard, some random dude in Mali is going to get dirty nukes, right? And we don't want that move on the chessboard, basically, if that makes sense. So
yes, it makes sense. So yeah, that's one of the ironic things is that the reasoning behind the International Space Station. Like, if you look at it from a scientific standpoint, like the research that those astronauts do up there is not worth the cost. I mean, most of it is kind of useless, or could be done on Earth just as easily, or could be done with an unmanned spacecraft, which is the kind of things that are actually doing most of the interesting space research right now. But there's a theory that says that when this was first set up in the 1990s, it's like a joint project between the United States and Russia that used to be the USSR, but was now much poorer. The actual secret motivation was basically, we want to make sure that all of these out-of-work Russian rocket scientists stay in Russia and keep working for Russia instead of going all over the developing world and working for people like Saddam Hussein and whoever will pay them to work on a missile program. So we're going to set up the International Space Station and pretend that it's scientifically very important, because that will keep these people at their good, well-paying jobs in Russia, where we can keep an eye on them. And I think as far as that goes, it succeeded. I mean, none of the Middle Eastern countries like Saddam Hussein, Iraq, Iran, I mean, we'd always talk about these as if they're threats, but none of them have actually gone anywhere close to launching a WMD at the United States. It's a totally empty threat. And if we'd have said, okay, the International Space Station plan worked, Iraq is not going to harm us, let's let Saddam Hussein stay in power, I mean, the world would be a better place today.
Yeah. Well, it was a make work program, and it was marketed to the public as, oh yeah, we're gonna have low Earth orbit space stations, and then this is like a precursor to having a base on the moon. Like, it was all bullshit, right? It was a make work program. What was the name of what was his name? It was the Pakistani nuclear scientist who stole secrets from Belgium and who got Pakistan the bomb, right? He was the only one that kind of slipped under the radar. They wanted him to actually have a job as well, so that he wasn't doing his thing. But he first went to Pakistan. He gave Pakistan the bomb. Then he went to North Korea and he gave North Korea the bomb, right? But basically, the thing that they were worried about, it wasn't like a conspiracy theory, right? If that makes sense. They were worried about something real, right? And to the extent that they quote unquote stopped it with that make work program, they kind of did, right? But I think now that international system is breaking apart, right? You're at that point where, it's not just nuclear technology, it's also basic technology with like chemical weapons and biological weapons and this kind of stuff, right? Also delivery systems, drone warfare, and the Ukrainians definitely have pioneered this with their they've done this very, very courageous defense of their homeland with their drones and stuff. But what people don't pay attention to is the way in which they've used these really small drones so effectively, and other people are now beginning to learn from them, as well as the Russians, I guess, right? Everyone who's serious about 21st century warfare, they're studying that war with like a microscope and seeing what's happening, right? And I think the Iranians, I think I put it on the Telegram group, but the Iranians have figured out a twin jet, very, very cheap drone, which can dive at like 500 kilometers an hour from like 9 kilometers up high in the atmosphere, right? Basically, it's way too fast for radar to see what's happening, way too small, and what have you. It's like a giant mosquito bite, if that makes sense, right? And so like that, and that's the future. The future is you're gonna have more and more of these technologies just break free, right? And you're gonna have more and more people have access to cheaper and cheaper weaponry, right? We are on the downslope, folks, and we're gonna see more and more interesting things happen with regard to this aspect, right? Which is why yeah. Go ahead, sir.
That's been a recurring problem, is for certainly since 1990, when we became 91, when America moved into being the quote sole superpower unquote. Our military procurement has been about pumping public money into private pockets. It's been a money pump. We create, we spend money on like shit like rail guns and space lasers, at a time when warfare is moving towards cheap, durable, reliable stuff and lots of it.
Yeah.
We're not we're building $30 million drones, and using them while our enemies are using like $30,000 and $3,000 drones.
Yeah. And the thing is, right? it's not just the state actors you got to watch out for. It's also the sub-state actors, right? And especially if you go to Nigeria, right? If you go to Nigeria, Nigeria has like an enormous population. It's got 230 million people or whatever, right? Very, very large civilian population. But if you actually look at its actual military, right? The military is like puny, right? The entire Nigerian military is like 230,000 or something, right? The entire budget for Nigeria is like $2 billion. By percentage of GDP, it's only 1%, but it makes no sense. If you think about it logically, it makes no sense. Okay, well, you've got this giant country by population, right? They have like 240 million people. They only have this many people in their military. What's going on here? What's going on is everyone who wants to actually quote unquote fight, they're going to these other places because they're simply more competitive, right? They're going to these terror groups, they're going to these militias, they're going to these other guys in the jungle, right? And they're not going there because, oh my gosh, these guys, I'm just a naturally violent person, therefore I'm going to be naturally violent. And who does that? Oh yeah, it's the fucking jihadist bros up here. And no, they're not doing it. These are rational actors. That's what I have to explain to people. These are extremely rational actors. Like the reason they're going to this place is because they're actually going to get paid more than the Nigerian military. Number one. Number two, many of the technologies that these guys have, they're not at the same level, not yet, but they're catching up. And they have a lot of these like cheaper stuff that is, at that level, right? And number three, right? They just have more freedom of movement. They can do whatever the fuck they want, right? And so it's like, well, you had Francis Fukuyama who said end of history. Then you had his mentor, Samuel Huntington, who said, no, it's going to be clash of civilizations or whatever, right? And those are not the only two options. There was a third option, right? And it was Robert Kaplan who wrote, first it was a small article, which was called The Coming Anarchy. And then there was a larger book, which was also called, I think, The Coming Anarchy. And his vision of the future, and I tend to agree with this one more, his vision of the future was the end of the Westphalian system gradually over several years and decades. And what does the world look like? Well, the world basically looks like a combination of Haiti and the Democratic Republic of Congo, where basically criminals, terrorists, and these guys, they run the show, right? And the reason they run the show is not because they are more clever, they're smarter, or whatever. No, it's just because they are capable of low energy dominant warfare, and these other guys are not, right? Like, good luck taking out the Haitian gangs when, like, you're sending in the Kenyan military, you're sending in British and Australian special forces. They still can't do anything to them. Why? Because, okay, well, you've got all these, like, big armored personnel carriers. We have a bunch of these, like, grenades and machetes and small drones, etc., and we can, like, hold our own against you, right? And eventually you'll see more and more breakthroughs, technological, innovative, etc., and eventually Haiti will be fully run by, Haiti will eventually, I mean, well, like Haiti will eventually just be run by criminals, right? I think it's going to be one of the first quote unquote real, like people say failed state. People actually don't know what failed state means, right? They kind of use it in a relative sense. I think like you're going to see an absolute sense of like failed state in many of these places, right? And then you're going to see migration flows, and it's going to spread like a contagion to other parts of the world.
In other words, you're going to see post-Roman Empire, post-Western Roman Empire. You're going to have a bunch of war bands start up. War bands gather territory. War bands like become, the former war leader becomes king, knight, governor, whatever term you use. And that's, I mean, I expect that. I mean, already south of the border, the cartels are doing drone strikes on each other. Yeah, drones, I mean, and we didn't come up with something where, okay, we can create a $30 million drone. It's like, do you realize like a $3,000 drone, $3,000 drones would do a better job. Spend that $30 million on $3,000 drones and swarm. That's what people are doing. We're creating. This has all kinds of super capabilities. It can go, it can go to this incredible height. It's got all these cameras. It's like, or you could fly in a bunch of cheap drones with like, not quite so good cameras to get the stuff.
There was a gentleman. I think he worked for the European Union in their like whatchamacallit. They have these like working groups that do like these lectures to the politicians on strategic issues. He used to work in like Belgium, like in Brussels. Then he worked for some other guys. Now he works for a bunch of these think tanks. His basic argument is that no European country in the year 2025 has the adequate tools to defend itself against anything close to what Ukraine is going through right now with regard to like, okay, well, if the Russians choose to launch 800 drones at one of your cities, right? And they just decide, you know what, man, we're just going to have fun. We're going to take our time nice and slow with you. Every 24 hours, we're going to hit you with 800 drones, right? His argument is that no European city, whether it's Berlin, Paris, etc., has the ability to stop that anymore, right? And the reason is not because oh, there isn't whatchamacallit. There isn't the technology. Well, okay, yeah, the technology exists. They're called interceptors, but the interceptors are simply too expensive, right? So there's not the mass and the quantity, right? So 800, well, I mean, that's actually not their peak. I think one of these like American analysts for like CSIS, he basically said, he was asked, okay, well, what is the max peak with regard to, let's say, the Russians just go crazy and they want to just do a giant drone swarm. He said it would probably be 10,000, right? It'd probably be 10,000 and they could probably sustain that for several weeks daily, right? And at that point, it's like, okay, well, what if they do that against European critical infrastructure? His basic answer was, we could probably intercept a few of them, right? And then we could probably tell the civilians, if you have your hunting rifles and your guns and stuff, please take them out and try to shoot them out with us. But 10,000 is simply too big a number, right?
Well, a drone like that's not something you shoot with a rifle. You need a shotgun for that kind of small drone.
Yeah. Yeah. That's basically their argument. Their argument is that their basic argument is that we as the government cannot fire off these interceptors to stop them. We would have to tell the public to take out their their rifles and their shotguns and try to shoot them out. But even then, that's just like, at that point you're throwing in the towel and you're just telling people that, okay, you have to figure out how to stop it. We can't really help you.
Yes, I mean it is kind of a mystery just how much competence is in the Russian regime, though, because when they first invaded Ukraine, nobody who thought highly of Russia expected that it would take this long.
Oh,
that the war would, nearly 4 years, and Ukraine still hasn't beaten yet. Nobody
that's right.
It would take them this long against a country with a quarter as many people, and yet it has. So it, and I've written about this before. I think that Putin's Russia is very much a declining empire. It has a lot of the same problems with the rest of Europe: brain drains, people leaving, collapse of manufacturing industries, and especially high tech and tool making. Mostly depending on just exporting raw materials instead of, like, in the 1950s and 60s, the Soviet Union was a technological leader of the world, and second only to the United States. And now they're nowhere near a technological leader like so many other countries.
India has India has surpassed them actually in many small civilian manufacturing with regard to electronics especially, right? I mean, obviously the Chinese produce stuff. Honestly, if you asked me, Ahnaf, what do you think is the reason why he's not launching 10,000 drones or whatever, I would say it's because he doesn't really have much depth left after, like, okay, so 1/3 of Ukraine is gone. What does he do then? Is he going to roll over Poland? I don't think so. I think, like, he's got demographic issues. He's got issues with regard to migration flows from Central Asia and onwards, right? And he's going to be dealing with that. I don't think, like, I don't believe in this concept of, like, Russia is going to roll into Germany again, like World War II style.
If you look at the birth rate data for the former Soviet republics, like, just rank them in terms of number of babies that were born this last year. Russia's number one, but it's barely number one. Number two is Uzbekistan, with like 3/4 as many people born. In that country, that's just on a map, it's tiny compared to Russia. But in terms of the size of the young people there, it's 3/4 of the size of Russia. If you add together Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, those 5 former SSRs, then put together, their crude birth rate, number of babies born in the last year, 1.5 times as many as were born in Russia. So Russia is not going to be a dominant power in that part of the world
No,
much
it won't.
longer. Give it a generation or two, and I expect pretty much all of Trans-Uralic Russia is going to be overrun by Central
They
Asia.
will see.
They will see
migration flows. They will see migration flows that make the 2015 migration flows in Europe look like a summer picnic. It's not even going to be close.
They will,
especially as the Afghan, like one of the guys you didn't talk about. I guess you didn't talk about it because like Afghanistan is not considered part of Central Asia, right? But you should check out the Afghan birth rate, right? And especially the way in which these guys are moving northwards. Yeah.
And like a third of the people there are ethnic Uzbeks, and it's just an accident of border drawing that keeps them away from Uzbekistan. But if they suddenly start invading Russia together, then they'll suddenly be like brothers again, and they'll carve out their own kingdoms. That's what you see in Dark Ages. That's what you see when Rome fell. You had the Visigoths, the Vandals, every part of it. Even places like North Africa. It was the Vandals went there, and they were like speaking a Germanic language there, and they might still be a German-speaking country today if Justinian hadn't destroyed the Vandal kingdom in his war to establish I think the Athanasian Creed and Orthodoxy over Arianism. So, and then of course it ended up in Muslim hands in the end. But basically, people migrate huge distances all over the place when a kingdom falls, and we don't think of Tunisia right now as part of the Germanic sphere of influence, but at one point it was. So,
that was all part of the big pond. The Mediterranean was the Roman pond, and then when the Visigoths came in, they were like, well, that's not just part of the Roman pond, that's the best part. That was kind of the prime me. I mean, people don't understand. Europe at that time was the ass end of the empire. North Africa had thousands of years of civilization. North Africa
did Asia Minor, the Levant, Syria, those places.
Yeah, not even just there. North Africa, you had the Amazigh, you had the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians had set up shop there. There was that was a highly civilized area. Western Europe, didn't meet the main category of civilization. We didn't have civis. We didn't have cities. We tended to form in towns and clan units.
Yeah, one of the requirements for civilization, is stratification of society, right? Which didn't exist there because, again, like you said, Sir Ken, has clans and family units, right? You don't have
in Latin, it literally just means city dwelling, from civitas, city. So
exactly.
Like when people say, like people talk about like the history of the American Indians, and you have people talk about the 5 civilized tribes, and some people say, well, that's offensive. It implies that the other tribes weren't civilized. We shouldn't use that anymore. And I'm like, dude, civilized just comes from a Latin word meaning city dwelling. The Cherokee and such had formed into towns and had printing presses and written laws and used money. They are civilized in the plain sense of the word. It's not a moral judgment. It's just about how you live. It's like
definition.
You hear someone calling someone a savage, and you think, oh, that's offensive. You shouldn't say that. But savage, it just comes from Latin silvanus, meaning forest dweller. That's why it's like a surname in England in some places, because some guy in England 500-600 years ago lived in a forest, and so everyone called him like John the Savage or Edward the Savage or whatever. That's how they got that name. So it's not, they weren't offensive terms originally, but they evolved that way because city dwellers, civilized people, look on country people as bumpkins, and that's how like the word pagan. It originally just meant a country bumpkin before it was a religious term. Heathen literally meant someone who lives on a heath is what it literally meant originally.
Like basically the equivalent of those poor benighted Africans with their fetishes and their cannibalism. It was like that was essentially what Roman Christians saw when they looked at European pagans.
Yes,
there are a bunch of superstitious.
That's how all these words for country dweller evolved to be terms of abuse, basically.
It's just like we live in interesting times. So sometimes when I talk to these migration people and they use the word civilization, like you were saying, Sir Wesley, they don't know where the word even comes from, right? And other times they're like, oh, the savages or whatever the fuck. And I just laugh. I'm like, bro, if you're calling yourself civilized, and you're calling this guy a barbarian or whatever the fuck, you're just telling everyone you're gonna lose.
Yeah, the barbarian, like the inevitable the
Yeah.
inevitable end of every civilization is it gets taken over by the barbarians who have an inferiority complex about like their way of living and who then try to emulate that previous civilization. Romans
Yes.
become Greeks
Yeah.
instead of like, well, the Latins, they're kind of like a you're kind of like ignorant but pugnacious. I mean, that was
And
what
like
people
how
thought of
in
the Latins.
England, like English decided to imitate the Romans. That's why it's like grammar guides say, don't split your infinitives. It's because in Latin you can't split the infinitive. It's literally just the verb is one word. And they'd say, oh, we need to sound more like Latin. Let's not split our infinitives. But let's not write the th sound with the letter thorn, because it used to be one letter in like Middle English, Old
Yeah. Yeah.
English.
Yeah. Yeah.
But they saw,
Exactly.
well, oh, in Latin, they don't have that letter. So let's be civilized and just write it th instead, so that we don't use barbaric letters that the more civilized languages don't have. It's very silly when you really think about it, the way
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
civilization will try to emulate a past civilization, which couldn't have been that great of a civilization, or it wouldn't have collapsed to begin with. So,
I mean, we
but
will.
everyone
I'm
does it.
sure that when the barbarians show up at the American gates, you'll probably have a lot of them calling themselves presidents and setting up like state and local governments using
President Juan.
President
Sir
Juan.
Ken. President Juan.
Oh yeah, I mean they will, and they will
Yeah.
start. A lot of them will start learning English, and English will become a prestige language that nobles speak amongst themselves. They'll create they will either look back on their Criollo roots and like how they're like Castizo, or they'll create that ancestry out of whole cloth. I mean,
Mhm.
if it goes the way it generally goes, because the barbarians generally look at the city and being barbarians, they're like, wow, look at this place, and so they
Yeah.
will think this is a civilization we need to emulate.
Yeah. Yeah. If you go to Kinshasa, Democratic Republic of Congo, right? It is a fascinating place, right? Uh, I think one guy was saying whatchamacallit. If you check the population of this place, right, and if you did the demographics, right, it has doubled in population every 10 or 12 years or something, right? And now I think the entire population is like 17 million something and still rising, right? But if you look at the architecture, the architecture is all like Western style. Okay, well, 10-story building here, 5-story building here, etc., etc. So yeah, like you're saying, Sir Kenneth, there's like that quote unquote inferiority complex, and also like this imitation, right? With regard to like, oh well, we gotta live like these other people and whatnot, right? And yet they've got like the world's largest, not largest, but fastest rate of urbanization in the world, right? Which is like every year urbanization rate's going up by 1%, which is insane, right? Absolutely insane. Uh, Most Western countries stopped urbanizing a long time ago, right? Which is why, hint, hint, nudge, nudge, folks, that's the reason why they're bringing in the migration. It's because they don't have any whatchamacallit, uh any peasants left in the countryside to dump into the cities. That's why they resort to migration.
Right. That is,
Yeah.
I mean, when I think about the future of the world, I'm one of the things that worries me especially is the fact that you really have two different systems of political major systems. There's a few eccentric outliers, but two major systems of political economy. You have first world countries, or the highly developed market economies, United States, China, South Korea, Japan, Europe, those kind of places that all have totally wrecked their fertility rates. South Korea worst, but they're all well below replacement because you've basically optimized people to be consumers. It's like they get as much education as they can, so they're usually in college for way longer than their job really needs, because we have credentialing laws that favor that, and interests that, like you were talking about earlier, make a lot of
Yeah.
money off of the student
Hmm.
loans. And then you get your job, you work hard, and people without a spouse or children are the best workers because they can put in the longest and most flexible hours. And then you have massive wealth transfers from the younger people to the older people. You don't have any nearly sized wealth transfers to people with small children underfoot. One thing I think America should do if we really care about the birth rate problem is to, like, say, if you have 3 or more kids, you're exempt from Social Security taxes. Basically, if the idea is to provide for old people in the future, there are 2 ways you can contribute to that: with your taxes or with your offspring. And if people don't have enough offspring, then all the taxes in the world are not going to make this solvent. Therefore, if you contribute more offspring than average, you should have to pay the tax. I think that would be a very good law to have. And then I think also the income tax. Right now, if you're one person, you file for your income taxes, the tax brackets are whatever they are. Maybe like it's, I think, $11,000 you don't pay any taxes on, and then there's brackets at 20,000, 35,000, or whatever that you go up. If you're married filing jointly, 2 people in the household, all those brackets double. So you pay no taxes on like the first 22,000, and then the brackets all change. I think if you're a married couple with 4 children, you should just multiply everything by 6. You pay no taxes on the first $66,000, and so forth. I think it should be totally multiplied by the complete number of people in your household, children and everything. I think that would make it easier to support families. Our laws don't really favor that at all, though. They're totally for the present because, I mean, investing in kids, it's going to be, I mean, in the old days, it might be 14, 15 years before they're productive on the farm. Now it's more like 30 years before they're productive. And the capitalist world just doesn't work that way. So it's all maximizing people as producers and consumers, not maximizing the next generation. So the fertility is collapsing. And then you have what I might as well call the third world political economy, which you see in a place like Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa, and which is based mostly on exporting raw materials, mine products, gold, copper, whatever you happen to mine there, oil, diamonds, and then farm products, pineapples or sugarcane or whatever you happen to grow in your country. And it doesn't really compete manufacturing wise because any manufacturing job, once that sugarcane is cut and you're going to like make it into refined sugar or whatever, or once the gold is mined and you want to make it into electronics or whatever you're doing with it, there's usually some other country that there's just a better place to manufacture things because the people are more educated. There's already a big network effect of lots of shops and factories there that can easily buy stuff from each other. And you have a less corrupt government system. You don't have to bribe as many people to start a business. You don't have to wait in lines as long. And so the moment that the product is movable, the moment that it's harvested from the ground or mined from the mine, it immediately becomes favorable to send it to one of the first world countries. But the first world still depends on the third world for raw materials. I mean, it could not meet its needs with only its own raw materials. And the third world relies on the first world for high-tech manufactured goods. Like when I was in Ghana a few years ago, I saw that the way they drink water there, you have these sachets, these are plastic bags with half a liter of water pressurized. You bite the corner off the bag and you suck the water out. That's how you get clean water because the tap water is not clean. And some people that I was there, they hated drinking that way and complained about it and said, I look forward to being back in Europe or wherever. And I didn't mind it at all. It was just like any other water to me. But the thing is, obviously, these are manufactured in Ghana because they're so cheap, it wouldn't make any sense to put them on an ocean liner, these whole pallets of, so you buy basically a whole pallet at the grocery store. But the machine that makes them, I'm pretty sure that that machine is not made in Ghana. It's got to be made in North America or Europe or China or somewhere. Same with all like the spare parts for the machine. And to have this high population densities in Africa, because historically the population there, it wasn't really limited by starvation, it was limited by disease. You get too many people in one place, tropical disease decimates them. And they hold that at bay because right now they have antibiotics, they have anti-malarial drugs, they have modern sanitation equipment to keep everything sort of clean. Not clean by American standards, but cleaner than it was a century ago. And all that, you import these medicaments from other countries. So if the first world collapses, if the birth rate problem finally causes our economy to fall to the floor, then people in Nigeria and such, they're not going to be able to get the spare parts for their water sachet machine. They're not going to be able to get the antibiotics they rely on, and things could get very ugly there very quickly. So you have these two systems that rely on each other, and unfortunately, it's not a reliance that's going to last forever. So that's, I think, one of the scariest things when I think about the future. What happens when that falls through? That you have the part of the world that can do high-tech manufacturing and the part
Yeah,
of the
yeah, yeah.
world that's having enough children to survive, and neither of them can really exist without the other. But our part isn't having enough children to survive. And whenever a country does
Yeah.
industrialize, like India over the last few years, what happens? Its fertility rate plummets, and India is now below replacement too. So, and I
Yeah,
mean, if any
the thing
part of
is,
Africa
One of my
industrializes,
yeah.
predictions.
If Kenya finishes industrializing over the next 20 or 30 years, they're probably going to be at some replacement fertility. They're already at lower fertility than every other country in the region. It's just very scary that whenever a country gains high-tech manufacturing abilities, it almost immediately loses the ability to have enough children to keep that going for more than a few generations.
The thing is, right, we have to talk about it specifically, right? So like when people say TFR, total fertility rate, what are they actually talking about? What they're talking about is if you take a woman and you look at her productive years, which is about 15 to about, 40 something, right? Sometimes it's lower, sometimes it's higher. Okay, whatever, right? 2.1 is the number, right? But the thing is, it's a lagging indicator, right? So, well, India is below replacement. Well, what does that mean? What that means is the slope is downwards, right? But
Right.
right now, in the year 2025, okay, India, number of births, roughly the estimate right now is 23 million on the low end, right? Projected deaths is about 9 million, right? So 23 minus 9 is 14. So you're still in the surplus. Okay, when do the lines intersect? The lines intersect sometime in 2065, right? 40 years, right? And so like, yes,
But
you're
by
correct.
that time, though, your biggest part of the population pyramid is going to be old people, and by that time,
Exactly.
it's kind of too late to turn things around. You're going to be like
Yeah.
France, what we were just talking about earlier, and
Yeah,
how
yeah, yeah, yeah,
the
yeah,
young
yeah,
people
yeah,
are
yeah,
leaving
yeah.
because it just isn't a young person's country anymore.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, I look at these models all the time. It's actually quite interesting. Some of these African countries, actually, what happens to them is the lines don't intersect in the 21st century. They intersect sometime in the 2200s, right? Um, there's going to be shortages of these higher end goods like medicines, machineries, etc., etc. I'm not really worried about the quote unquote third world. I think that's the wrong term. I think the term we should talk about is like emerging economy versus like industrialized economies, newly industrialized economies like
Well,
China
that implies that every
versus
economy there is going to successfully emerge, and some of them are making progress, and some of them are not. And then you got
yeah,
to
that's
think
that,
that
that's the thing.
I
a
That's
really
the
first
thing
world
though.
country can become a third world country, like the United
Yeah,
States.
yeah.
yeah.
There's
Our
a few different.
exports are consisting more and more of raw materials as our manufacturing
Yeah,
base goes away, and so
exactly. Yeah,
we
yeah.
are evolving
Those are not
toward
the
that
only two
same step. We're
categories.
not there yet,
Yeah,
but we're in that direction.
yeah. Those aren't the only two categories, right? Like the category of emerging economy. Okay, what's it gonna emerge into? It could emerge into a newly industrialized economy, or it could become like a de-industrial economy, right? And that's why I'm not really worried about Nigeria. The reason I'm not worried about Nigeria is because Nigeria has a median age of like 18 or something, right? Very low number. If you actually check their births, right? By raw births, they're only going to top sometime in the 2045 range. And even by century's end, projected births and deaths are not going to cross, right? Right? What's going to happen to them is, okay, well, we don't have enough medicines or whatever the fuck, right? Oh, well, sucks to be us. Well, what do? Oh, hey, Italy and Germany, can you give it to us? Well, no, we can't. And it's like, okay, well, I guess we'll send some men over there to grab it by force, basically. And you just have a bunch of grandpas. And, like, what are the grandpas going to do? They're going to fight us in the military? Oh, right, sure. A bunch of 70-year-old
Well,
grandpas are
that's
going to fight us.
assuming that Italy still has the ability to manufacture medicines, which they're not going to have forever. So you got
Probably,
to remember
yeah,
that.
I
probably.
mean,
Yeah,
I think
probably it. That's the
one
reason.
thing
Yeah.
Wesley said that jumped out at me was when he talked about like the high tech stuff. Here's one of my predictions, and I won't be around to see if I'm right. 500 years from now, like historians will look back on our trade routes with absolute awe. I mean, at no time in human history have you had the kind of globe spanning trade routes that you do. And we've all come to rely on them. I mean, yeah, it's going to hit Africa hard when like it becomes a lot harder to ship those machines into Africa. It's going to get real hard on us when we can't get the Chinese stuff coming in. I mean, I think the collapse of the global trade route system, which hasn't happened yet, but you can already see the system is fraying around the edges, is going to be the
Yeah.
beginning of a major world decline. I mean, I would expect
Yeah.
that in Africa, you will see some local industrialization. You're all, of a kind, just because they'll have to. You'll also see a lot of people reverting back to, essentially African peasant lives with, we got a few subsistence farming.
The
Of course, I
hilarious
also would
thing,
expect to see
yeah,
that in the United States too. We still got lots of land.
the hilarious thing about Africa is that they don't have to revert to anything, right? They already are in a low energy dominant space. And with regard to like, okay, well, agriculture and we gotta grow enough yams to feed people. I mean, right now they're doing fine, right? Because a lot of that, like Sir Wesley was saying, the main limit factor was not access to arable land. The main limit factor for Africa was disease, right? Like, why did like quote unquote civilization not happen in like the dense jungles of the Congo and many of these other places, right? Well, it's because of the tsetse fly, right? The tsetse fly would like destroy your livestock and it would give you yourself sickle cell anemia, right? And so that's the thing. It's like the bottleneck has been broken, and what? There were 220 million people in Africa in like 1930. There's over 1.5 billion people now, right? And it's increasing more and more. I mean, honestly, I've looked at the population models, even in the case of a population crash, which is what I expect. And okay, we get to 3 billion people or 2.5 billion people by century's end, right? Even in that scenario, right, a significant majority of the world's population, 50, 60% plus, end up being African in that scenario, right? The proportion actually goes up, right? And the reason it goes up is because if you start applying like decreases, right? Yeah, the African birth rate drops, but everyone else also drops as well, and they reach negative faster, right? I mean, like what? Last year it was 70 million births. 35 million of the births were in sub-Saharan Africa, right? Europe was like negative 2 million. And then if you added up everyone else from all the other parts of the world, you would get another like 37, 38 million, which balances out to 35 million. So right now, with the quote unquote normal state of affairs, where like, okay, some societies have the first world standard of living, others, okay, well, they're declining and deindustrializing, others are like kind of emerging, kind of not. That's what you get, right? But if you take the video and you fast forward it, what happens, right? What happens is the more severe the population crash becomes, right? Let's say population crash to 6 billion. Well, then the number of Africans increase. Well, population crash of 4 billion. Well, then the proportion of Africans increase, and so on and so forth, right? And that's what seems to be happening, like with regard to, well, what does the 21st century look like? The 21st century looks like this scenario where, like, yeah, there's population decline everywhere, but the guy who declines the least ends up being Africa, right? And so as a net percentage of all of humanity, their percentage goes up basically. So at least that's what the numbers are saying right now. So
right.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'm just very suspicious of taking those UN projections to even the end of the 21st century, because those projections are based on peace and prosperity and no hard constraints on the ability of people to reproduce themselves and stay alive to a ripe old age. And yet, if you see a major war breaking out in Asia in the next 10 or 20 years, if you see a sudden stoppage in the global trade in pharmaceuticals or the global trade in fertilizers, then those numbers are way too optimistic.
Yeah, I don't even follow their numbers. I just use them to make a point with people. Like I use their numbers because what I tell people is this is the rainbows and sunshine scenario, right? Like, because the UN numbers say that world population peaks at 10.8 billion and then it drops to like 10.2 billion by century's end, right? And the funny thing is, in that scenario, the number of Africans on the planet becomes like 35%, right? And what I tell people is, okay, now to the UN medium scenario, now add in your favorite variety of apocalypse. I don't know, like 12 world wars or like, 25 civil wars or whatever the fuck, right? Or even like not even that stuff. Just add basic -1% modifier for the next 50 years or whatever, 2050 to 2100, right? In that scenario, like the percentage of Africans goes up. It's no longer 35%. It becomes 40, then 50, then 60, and so on and so forth, right? And it has to do with like mathematics for like young people with regard to like, okay, well, if you have this many young people, you have this much of a military, and if that other guy has this many old people, his military is going to be this big, right? And based on that, and based on material energy constraints, right? The fact that you're declining less than the other guy, right? He's gonna get the advantage, right? I mean, we're already seeing it in a certain sense with regard to these small conflicts in the Congo, with regard to like Rwanda, right? I mean, Rwanda is basically using these militias of like 15 and 16-year-olds, and they're like capturing these villages and stuff, right? Uh, Low-tech methods of fighting, low-tech warfare. It hasn't yet gotten to the point where, like we said, right, some random African dude has access to, WMDs or whatnot in the jungles, right? But eventually that moment will also come, right? Like especially as like we were talking about Italy, right? Well, Italy loses the ability to make high-tech medical devices or whatever. Okay, well, that's the civilian side. Well, what happens if America or China or Russia loses the ability to upkeep and maintain their basic nuclear facilities, and one or more of these places, maybe it's migrant labor, maybe it's somebody else, the stuff just gets stolen and then reverse engineered, right? By a bunch of young people. They're just like, oh, we just want to have fun, right? No ideology, no nothing. They're just like, oh, we just want to have fun. Wouldn't it be cool if we can make a tiny, dirty nuke, right? And they just steal this stuff, right? And I mean, that's what I think the future is going to be, man. Like the future is just going to be things fall apart, people can't maintain it. They take in migration to kind of maintain the facade of industrial civilization. One or more of the migrants, out of the millions that they take, they steal the technology, right? They reverse engineer it. And then a few decades later, there's just like, proliferation of said technology, right? And then they use it to spread everywhere else, right? Kind of like, you have a forest floor, the organisms are fighting, right? The big tree is dying, and a bunch of lichen and moss at the bottom. They just spread everywhere after everyone else is dead, basically. So that's kind of grim outlook, but that seems to be the realistic outcome, right? Especially
Yes.
with yeah.
I'd probably say I'm not quite so pessimistic, because I do think that by the time that countries like the United States are forced to revert to a more agrarian population,
Yeah.
and the wheels come off the industrial economy, I think the people that survive that will be high fertility people, because you just have a selection
Mhm.
effect. Darwinian selection of the
Yeah.
fittest, and in the 20th, 21st century, part of being the fittest is somebody who like maybe has a mental attraction toward religion or likes kids. I mean, in the past, it's just a matter of, oh, you want to have sex, you have a sex drive, you have a bunch of kids. Now we have
Yeah.
contraception. Having a big sex drive is not as evolutionary adaptive. That just means
Mhm.
that our selective pressure is going to favor people who are like actually attracted to high birth rate cultures, or
Yeah,
who like
exactly,
have a
exactly.
conscious desire for companionship and offspring and all that. So I think
Yeah.
that'll have a positive effect, and also the fact of eventually the wheels will come off of the industrial economy, and you won't
Yeah.
really have the option of being an office drone or an office plankton, even if you want to. And,
Yeah.
so more people are likely to live in rural places and then have a bunch of kids because they
Bet
need
on
them to
the
help on the
Amish.
farm.
Yeah.
And
The
yeah, the
Amish are
Amish are
going to
doing
be
great.
like, they're doing great. They're like, oh, so there'll be no electricity. We have to like fertilize our fields with manure because there's no organic, like, no petroleum based fertilizer. Wow, that'll be just like Tuesday. Yeah, I mean, and they have a high birth rate. It's very possible that like large swatches of the United States are going to be like, essentially Amish territory.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I'm
Yeah.
skeptical of that, because they are pacifists and they believe in staying out of government. So they're not really going to control territory, but there will be more of it, I
Yeah.
think, and they will be a valued part of whatever civilization arises, just in much the same way that like Middle or Arab Christians and Jews were like a valued minority in most of the great Muslim civilizations. They weren't like politically in charge, but the rulers were very careful to keep whatever ancestral promise that had been made by like the Rashidun caliphs to tolerate and protect the Christians or the Jews. And in exchange for this, the Christians and Jews who knew better than to really try for military dominance of the society, but they became very great like intellectuals, craftsmen, physicians, mathematicians, and all that. So, like a very large part of what we call the Islamic Golden Age in science was really the Christian and Jewish minorities that were given this kind of ambiguous status, privileged in some ways, disprivileged in other ways, but certainly they were considered a very important part of the society by the people that ran. I think the Amish are going to be like that because we'll definitely depend. It'll be definitely be very good to have Amish people around in a collapse situation because they know how to grow lots and lots of food with primitive methods, but they won't be able to wield political power because they don't believe in wielding political power as part of their theology. So more like what we saw in Christians and Jews in the Middle East 1,000 years ago.
Yeah, like pacifism is not really a strategy that's gonna, like you're saying, there'll be a minority, some people will like him and they're like, oh, you're part of the society, but the actual dominant force is gonna be violence. Because one of the things, I'm finishing up the paper, right? I'll probably, maybe today or the day after tomorrow, I'll try and publish it on Tree of Woe with Potter's permission, but like, what I argue in the paper, and I use a fucking fancy word because I like being fancy, but in mathematics there's a fancy word. It's called hysteresis, right? Hysteresis
I know that word.
So hysteresis basically means that you've got a system, right? And based on the history of the system, right, there's a dependency relation, and it kind of like tends towards a certain direction, right? Limits to growth is the most excellent example of that with regard to what it actually tells you. What it tells you.
To get a word in sideways, I'd like to kind of explain the scientific definition better because I am studying physics in school and I actually work with this. So usually in science, when we say there's hysteresis in a curve, that means that when you move the system in one direction and when you move the system back, the curves don't overlap. So think like maybe you have a spring, and when you stretch it just a little, it like obeys Hooke's law perfectly, and the relationship between how far you stretched it and the force of the spring pulling it back is perfectly linear. You stretch it twice as far, you get twice as much force. But then suppose you stretch that spring too much. You stretch it so far it begins to deform the metal. It's still, when you gradually reduce that force, it still contracts again. But if you plot the stress versus extension curve, it's not the same. Like one end of that curve is depressed because the spring didn't quite return to its original shape on the original line because you stretched it too far, you had a bit of deformation. That's what we call hysteresis in science or engineering.
Yeah. I was talking more about the mathematical definition, but yeah, you're correct. Everything you said is correct. In terms of like limits to growth, right? What it shows is that you can have a starting system, and the starting system has certain principles, right? One of them is, okay, well, high energy and material throughput, right? And because of that, again, you were talking about damage to the system. Yeah, there are certain effects that happen. And then when you have the crash down, right, you don't get back to that prior state because of what had happened earlier, right? And, like limits to growth is one example. Another example would be the famous Elk Island experiments where like, okay, well, the elk population explodes to 6,000, right? Then it crashes back down. But then what happens is, okay, now you have 48 or 50 elk left, but their fertility rate is still completely destroyed, right? You have like this hysteresis in the sense that, well, why is it not behaving this way? Well, it's not behaving this way because of the previous state of the system, right? Whereas, if you used only quote unquote common sense, right? Common sense would have told you, well, 40, 50 elk left, but hey, there's so many resources still, and they got all freed up or whatnot. So why aren't the elk reproducing again, right? So what I'll basically argue in the paper, and it's almost done, but what I'll argue in the paper is that eventually high energy material throughput and warfare related to that is going to fall apart. And when it does fall apart, you're not going to have an exact return to industrial warfare. You might see some quote unquote high tech stuff. Like I think Sir Wesley, you talked about like the hunting rifles from the 17 and 1800s and stuff, and some other technology. I would agree with you. I would say some stuff remains, but for the most part, even if you try to like bring it back, it's not going to come back, right? Like warfare is going to be perpetually low energy into the distant future. Once industrial society is gone, right?
I mean, one
Um,
thing you've got to think about is that societies don't decline uniformly. Like, think of Constantinople when Rome fell.
yeah.
Western Roman Empire, it became a bunch of rural barbarian kingdoms.
Hmm.
Constantinople became a lot poorer than it used to be, but it stayed an urban civilization all throughout the decline of Rome and the rebuilding of medieval civilization. And it stayed an
Yeah.
urban civilization with urban manufacturers. I think we're going to see that in the coming Dark Age as well, especially places with like lots of hydroelectric power. It's like
Yeah,
Niagara Falls, places like Norway, Iceland. Iceland is
yeah,
actually the highest per capita electricity user in the world today. And it's all
yeah.
hydropower. It's just, there's only like 250,000 people there, but they make huge amounts of aluminum with the cheap hydroelectric power because you refine
They use
bauxite to make electricity.
yeah. They use like geothermal, right? Like they use like the hot water at the bottom of their land or whatever. Like they use that
So,
stuff, right? That's their
So
secret.
basically, if the wheels fall off of the industrial economy, and I'm speaking a bit dramatically, it'll really be like a century-long process of decline. That means obviously you're running out of fossil fuels if they're physically limited, and then things like solar power depend on extremely complicated supply chains that are not going to survive the coming wars and other disruptions, which basically
Yeah.
leaves you with things like biofuels and solar thermal power and wind and
Yeah.
very
And
limited sources of
hydropower
power.
basically.
And
Yeah,
hydropower is the
hydropower.
most important one because I think that'll actually sustain the handful of manufacturing centers. So, like, my
Mhm.
idea of a realistic economy in a few centuries is like most of America's in a dark age, but Niagara, New York, is a huge booming city that manufactures stuff. And they don't actually manufacture fancy stuff by our standards. Maybe they manufacture stuff like transistor radios and repeating rifles. But if
Yeah.
you're living in like the real dark age part of America, like in the middle of the Rocky Mountains, and a merchant comes along in a canoe offering repeating rifles, you'll give a lot for that repeating rifle or the transistor radio or whatever he's selling. So
Yeah.
it's not something to wink at, the idea that some urban centers will survive all the way through the dark age, because there are always places to be like, even the Bronze Age collapsed, really the first recorded dark age at the end of a civilization in like 1200 BC. Egypt
Yeah.
handled that quite a bit better than Greece or the Hittites did, and there's always some places that handle it better than others. So that's what I
Mhm.
think a large part of my work with like the Twilight Patriot blog. And like I say, yes, America's declining. Here's why. There's actually lots of reasons. It's like the blind men and the elephant. You know the old story of the six blind men. They feel a different part of the elephant,
Yeah.
and they start arguing
Mhm.
like it's like a spear. No, it's like a tree, and whatever. Decline of civilization, in my opinion, is a bit like that. You have libertarians saying, well, America's economy is falling apart because we have too much regulation and too many lawsuits. And then you have like the
Mhm.
traditionalist Catholics and Christians and saying, well, the fertility rate is like 1.4. We're not supporting family formation. That's going to do us in. And then you have environmentalists saying, we are burning through fossil fuels way faster than it's sustainable. If we don't fix this, then this will do us in. We need to learn to live in harmony with nature. And I'm like saying,
Yeah.
you all have a piece of the puzzle. You're all feeling part of the elephant. And yeah, you're arguing with each other because you feel a different part of the elephant and you think what you're saying is the whole thing. But there's actually a lot of causes for the decline of our way of life. The reason that I
Yeah.
say this isn't, I don't personally feel like it's something to despair over, because I mean, yeah, some people live in hard times, some people live in easy times, but if you're an American patriot, then you probably admire people like George Washington, Ben Franklin, even as recently as Teddy Roosevelt, who grew up in a civilization that was technologically much more primitive than ours. But they still found ways to live exciting lives, to live lives of service to their country, to fight for their rights as Americans. And to the
Yeah.
mere fact that we might have to go back to something closer to their material level, with more people being farmers and more kids like getting apprenticed to a trade when they're 12, that doesn't stop you from basically becoming an American in mind, body, and soul with like traditional American patriotic virtues. Like, I think that's an
Mhm.
opportunity to regain our real national character when most of us are actually living as farmers, working with our hands more. Politics is more local because the resources to administer a 20th century style bureaucracy don't exist anymore. I think, yeah, it's going to be harder in some ways. We'll have less material goods. Life will involve a bit more pain and suffering. We'll have to bury more people when there's still children. That will be sad. But I mean, I am a religious person. I believe in God. I believe in the immortality of the soul. And because of all that, I don't think that the end purpose of life is to be a consumer. I think, at least as an American who admires the founding fathers and all that they stood for, I think that the best life is the kind of life that they lived, where you're hardworking, supporting a family, you're politically engaged in a government that's mostly local, you know who your neighbors are and they know who you are, and you have to work hard for the things you want in life, but you're also part of a small locally based community that honors you for what you do, largely as part of like voluntary associations. Like one thing I did this year, I read several biographies of Benjamin Franklin, since he's probably the founding father that I most admire. And one thing that really sticks out at you, in addition to realizing, wow, this guy has like every talent under the sun. In addition to that, just realizing how much of the stuff he did as like a leader of voluntary civic organizations that only later became something for the government to do. Like he decides, well, I love to read books. My friends love books, but there aren't very many books in America. Let's found a library society. We each put in 40 shillings and a 10-shilling annual membership fee after that, make a list of books to order from England. Basically, they put them in a room in their house. A few years later, the state legislature or the colonial legislature of Pennsylvania, which is meeting at the place later called Independence Hall, although by then it's just the state house, they say, we really like your library. We'll give it a room in the state house. So they do. They take it to the state house, and then suddenly the whole legislature is using this library that was originally a private project. The state house itself was a private project. A man named, I think, William Allen, who was a member of the legislature, would later be Chief Justice from a rich family. He buys the land for it, starts persuading everybody, we need a state house. But before the government actually appropriates any money for it, these private citizens have already put hundreds of pounds of their own money into it and drawn up the plans. And the government says, oh, we like your idea. We're going to appropriate money and buy it and use it as a state house. Same with the fire department. Like, we're used to fire departments that are public service. Ben Franklin's day, it was the fire club. Like, you form 20 guys from your neighborhood into a club. They agree to spend one social night each month discussing fires and fire prevention and like the safest way to carry coals around your house. And everybody has to have their buckets ready and have to be ready to go at a moment's notice to put out any fire that starts in the neighborhood. All these voluntary organizations that are just started by men who they're just excited to do interesting things to support the community. And only after they put their own effort into it for quite a while does the government decide we're going to appropriate money for it too. So I just think that a more decentralized America, a perhaps less technologically advanced, but I really do hope we can hold on to the best parts of the technological revolution. I mean, I don't think we're going to hold on to everything, but I hope we hold on to radio. I hope we hold on to antibiotics. And I think we can if we acknowledge that our civilization is falling apart and make a conscious effort to preserve technologies like that, and just in small hobbyist clubs, enthusiast clubs. I think preserving our civilization, it's going to be a lot like building our civilization. It's going to be a small society decides we need to preserve this piece of civilization. And only later does the government realize, oh, what these people are doing is useful. We should support that too. So perhaps in the year 2200, one of the little successor kingdoms that emerged from the United States, maybe the president, because they'll call himself a president, even if it's hereditary, maybe the president of Denver or whatever, goes to the ham radio club of Denver and says, you guys have been working very hard to keep ham radio alive solely because you are passionate about it. Well, now I've persuaded my little parliament or Congress or whatever he calls his little rubber stamp council, I've persuaded them to give you a presidential patent and a big annuity of so many silver mega dollars, because maybe they mint a coin that says $1 million on it because of inflation, but it's made of silver because everybody by that time knows you need silver in your coins or whatever they're doing. But I mean, I think a lot of our technology, a lot of our way of life, if it gets preserved, it's going to be preserved by small voluntary societies, just like it was created
Yeah.
in 200 years ago.
Yeah,
That's why
small voluntary. Yeah, small. Yeah, like small voluntary and also like religious groups, people who are not doing it to make a quick buck. The long-term thinking will only come from people who are doing it from a higher purpose. It's not gonna be like the fucking merchant class of like, yeah, man, let's make some money or whatever the fuck, right? Like these people will run around the place and go become like looters and scavengers.
right. I
Those
mean,
aren't
like the
gonna be the
people that
guys who, yeah,
build ham radio today, there's hardly any money. And people that build and sail tall ships as a hobby, there isn't much
yeah,
money in. But I think 100 years from now, that's how most of our commerce is going to be carried, because I think that
yeah,
the fossil fuels are going to become too scarce, and
yeah.
also with supply chains shrinking, it just won't
Mhm.
be as efficient to have a super tanker anymore if there's just less stuff to carry around, and labor is going to get cheaper too. So suddenly a
Yeah.
tall ship will seem viable again. And the people that preserve that are basically hobbyists right now, but
Mhm.
it's the hobbyists that are going to matter in the long run.
Yeah.
I think that's
Yeah.
probably one thing I think we might see after that would be trade guilds coming out of that. Where do the
Yeah.
guilds come from? Like, well, these guys who were blacksmiths passed the trade down, and now they're the people that are making the iron plows and like building like bayonets and guns.
hmm Yeah. That'll be a very, very interesting world, and one which probably, you know, the descendants of the industrial world, yeah, they'll probably be in that line of work if they haven't become a raider or a marauder by then or what have you. But that'll be how things are, right? Uh, with that being said, Sir Kenaz, we are at 2.5 hours with
Yeah,
Sir Wesley.
if
Uh,
this is a good time for me to go, if it's a good time to wrap things up, what
unless Sir Wesley has something important slash relevant slash whatnot to convey to
I
our
don't think
dear
I have
listeners.
much more to convey, because what I was just saying is kind of the gist of it all. I think that, I mean, I'm glad Trump won the election. There's a few things he's been very good on. I'm glad he appointed conservative judges. I'm glad he is forcing America's putative allies in Europe and Asia to bear more of the burden of their own defense. He's doing a few things right. He's doing a lot of other things very wrong, like with the tariffs. He does have the emotional maturity of a 10-year-old child. He lies a lot. He's corrupt. He can't turn around most of the problems that are doing our society in. So I basically have the Twilight Patriot thesis. We are heading on a slow, ragged decline to a new dark age. And the people that do best are the people that acknowledge this is happening, and also acknowledge that, well, preserving the things I care about, whether that's keeping my own children safe and taking charge of their own education so that they end up with my own religious beliefs and not somebody else's, whether that's I'm going to learn how to grow some of my own food so that I can keep a kitchen garden going, or I'm going to be involved in ham radio, or preserving some other technology that I'm passionate about. The people that think that way are going to be the people who matter in the long run and help to rebuild American civilization when it finally gets rebuilt. Because I think it will be. I think we have a great culture as Americans, a great civilization, and the fact that we kind of lost a lot of those virtues during the 20th century when we had this life of ease, 24/7 entertainment via television, bread and circuses. Any society will do that. Any society that has too much luxury, too much ease, too much distractions for too long will do what we did as Americans. I don't think that it reflects badly on the American founding or proves that, well, actually, the founding fathers set up a liberal society and liberalism is responsible for like the low birth rates. No, it's not. China has this problem worse. Illiberal societies have this problem worse, so long as they have the phones in their hands and the other distractions. Once that goes away, we'll get a chance to rebuild. It will be hard, I think, but I also think it will be worth it. We do have to see through the illusions. We do have to see through the fact that the Constitution is not going to save us, because the Constitution means whatever a handful of judges in Washington say it means. And what it means right now is basically Donald Trump can order the military to sink a fishing boat and kill everyone on board, and it's not a crime. Or prosecutors can find genetic evidence that doesn't support their case and then just bury it in a lab drawer and tell nobody about it, and it's perfectly legal. I mean, that's what we have right now. The Constitution is not going to save us. What can save us is basically people doing what they did in 1776, armed insurrection against very serious abuses of power. But that'll take a while before people are tough enough and the distractions have gone away. Because bread and circuses is a powerful thing. And right now, bread and circuses is more like DoorDash and sports ball, but it gets the job done. So I think it'll be decades before America has any violent insurrections or civil wars that are big enough to actually threaten the status quo. January 6th was play acting. January 6th was a LARP. The serious disturbances are, I think, a few decades in the future still. But it's still possible for people today to have a clear head, to be careful about how your own children are educated, and to develop useful skills that will let you preserve some of the more useful parts of technology and of your American heritage too. And that's kind of my thesis as Twilight Patriot. If you believe in the immortality of the soul, if you believe that living a great material life and consuming a lot is not the end all and be all of existence, then you really shouldn't be too pessimistic about what's likely to happen in the future, that you're going into a world that's a bit more like what your ancestors lived in 1800, 1900, and a bit less like the post-1945 orgy of consumption and of kind of looking away from the blunter facts about human nature. So that's the future we're headed towards, and I think that if you prepare for it and keep your eyes open and your head screwed on tight and a clear mind, I think it's not really something to despair over if you know what's happening and are proactive about it. That's what I've got.
Nice. All right, Sir Kenaz, and with that being said, I think we can do the mandatory outro.
The mandatory outro. To all of you optimists, to everybody who thinks that the line go only up, to all of you positive thinkers.
Your soul is mine.